Barbed wire stretches endlessly across frozen fields, guard towers loom over shadows of despair, and behind these walls, humanity witnessed one of the darkest chapters in history. Auschwitz was not just a camp, it became a symbol of cruelty, survival, and remembrance. In this long immersive documentary, we will journey through the entire history of Auschwitz, from its creation under Nazi rule to the daily horrors faced by prisoners, the resistance within its fences, and finally its liberation and legacy. Every moment is told in detail with care, so you can drift into sleep while learning history in its fullest depth. As you settle in, I'd love to know, where are you tuning in from tonight, and what time is it for you right now? Drop it in the comments, because our community is listening together from all over the world. If you find value in these extended stories, remember to subscribe and join our growing community. Each night we bring you a new chapter of history to help you relax, reflect, and rest. Now let's begin the story of Auschwitz. In the serene tranquility of southern Poland, set against rolling fields and the unhurried flow of the Solar River, was a small town named Auschwitz, a name that previously held no significant historical weight. A peaceful locale of cobblestone roads, local markets, and Catholic steeples, it passed its seasons in quiet obscurity. That changed when war arrived, as the Wehrmacht invaded Poland in September 1939, bringing the roar of tanks and the cold finality of occupation. Everything was altered, and it was right here, in the town of Auschwitz, soon to be Germanized as Auschwitz by its conquerors, that the very earth would start to feel the burden of one of history's most terrible chapters. Yet long before the chilling smokestacks, the gas chambers, and the haunted gaze of its survivors, Auschwitz began modestly, not as a death factory, but as a compound of old Polish military barracks situated in a wooded area. These brick structures had once served the Polish army, a remnant of the Austro-Hungarian Empire's military presence, and had stood for decades, marked only by the passage of time. But the Nazis, in their systematic obsession with transforming ordinary locations into tools of terror, saw its potential. During the first year of their rule, the SS, responsible for suppressing resistance, handling prisoners, and enacting the racial dogmas of the Reich, sought a place to detain the escalating numbers of Polish political captives. Jails in cities such as Kraków and Tarnów were at capacity. A larger, more remote, and expandable facility was necessary. The location at Auschwitz was perfect, isolated yet served by rail, quiet yet reachable. The river nearby could supply water, and the open terrain allowed for expansion. Thus, in early 1940, the initial moves were made. German planners inspected the barracks, assessed the area, and the concept of Auschwitz as a concentration camp began to materialize. Not yet the industrial killing center it was destined to become, but instead a central point for holding and brutalizing enemies of the regime. The camp was officially sanctioned by a decree from Heinrich Himmler on April 27, 1940. By June, the inaugural transport of inmates had arrived. These were not Jewish people, but Polish political prisoners, resistance fighters, and members of the intelligentsia. The first contingent, 728 men, was brought from the prison in Tarnów. They were given striped clothing, and their names were replaced by serial numbers. Beatings started right away. Forced labor ensued, and death was an imminent reality. In those initial days, Auschwitz was not yet defined by gas or cremation, but by starvation, sickness, exposure, and the savage whims of its SS overseers. Still, it was a seed, the cruel inception of something immeasurably larger. Commanding this new camp was SS Sturmbannführer Rudolf Höss, a man whose placid exterior hid a terrifying capacity for organizing mass misery. His directives were clear: construct a camp that could house thousands, impose strict discipline, and crush the prisoners' spirits. Hess carried out his orders with exactitude. Under his command, Auschwitz-Erith, the main camp, started to expand. More structures were built. Fences and watchtowers were erected. Brick by brick, a prison city came into being. The camp's infamous gate, with its now legendary and profoundly cynical sign, "Albeit Macht frei, work sets you free," was placed over the main entrance. To the inmates it was a sadistic jest. There was no liberty in Auschwitz, only unending days of toil, starvation, and terror. The prisoner count rapidly increased. Although originally for Polish prisoners, the camp soon began to accept others: Soviet POWs, Roma, German convicts, and eventually Jewish people. But at this stage, the Holocaust had not yet fully commenced. Anti-Jewish laws had existed for years, and ghettos were being created, but systematic extermination had not yet become official Nazi policy. Auschwitz in its first months was a labor camp, though one governed by brutality and death. Nevertheless, even at that time, the seeds of genocide were already taking root. The SS was in a state of constant experimentation. They developed punishment methods. They erected the first simple gallows. They started using gas for small-scale killings, testing Zyklon B in Block 11. Initially a pesticide for killing lice, Zyklon B released lethal hydrogen cyanide gas when exposed to the atmosphere. It would soon become the primary weapon of Auschwitz, but those first applications were minor, discreet, and concealed. The larger apparatus of mass extermination was still in development. During these formative years, the local Polish community grew increasingly conscious that something terrible was developing on their town's periphery. Rumors spread, individuals vanished. Columns of weary prisoners were seen trudging through the fields. Smoke emanated from chimneys where no fires should have been burning, and the trains persisted. Long, dark trains with their sliding doors sealed shut, pulling up near the camp to unload their human freight in the dead of night. For the Germans, the town of Auschwitz was renamed and wholly repurposed. The local Polish residents were evicted from sections of the town. German families were brought in as colonists. The area around the camp was designated an SS zone of interest, a buffer that could be enlarged as needed. Land was appropriated, houses were leveled, and the mechanism of Nazi authority enveloped the town like a strangling vine. As 1941 neared, the camp transitioned into a new phase. The invasion of the Soviet Union that summer led to a fresh wave of prisoners. Red Army soldiers captured on the Eastern Front, many classified as politically suspect or racially subhuman. These men, often arriving on the brink of starvation, were cast into the camp without compassion. Very few lasted more than a few weeks. In that same year, the Nazis started planning for an even more sinister project: the establishment of a second, much larger camp a short distance away. This would become Auschwitz II, later known as Birkenau. Initially planned for Soviet POWs, Birkenau's eventual size would far exceed the SS's original designs. It was here on the boggy plains near the village of Brzezinka that the Nazis would construct their primary death factory, but for the time being, it was merely a blueprint. The structures had not been built, the crematoria had not yet been fired, and still the future had already begun to solidify. Meanwhile, inside Auschwitz I, the SS started preparing the foundation for industrial-scale murder. In September 1941, in the basement of Block 11, the camp's prison within a prison, SS personnel performed the first mass gassing with Zyklon B. The subjects were Soviet prisoners and Polish inmates chosen for the experiment. The outcome was considered effective, silent, and efficient, and from that point on, the concept of using gas to eliminate not just individuals but entire populations became a central doctrine of the Nazi regime. In the ensuing months, Auschwitz began to change its function. No longer simply a site for punishment or labor, it was evolving into a laboratory for extermination. The bureaucratic engine of the Nazi state hastened this change. In January 1942, the infamous Wannsee Conference was convened in Berlin, gathering high-level Nazi officials to orchestrate the final solution to the Jewish question. It was there that the decision was made. The Jews of Europe were to be annihilated en masse. Although killings had already started in the East through mass shootings and mobile gas vans, this was to be a different endeavor. This was industrialized, methodical, continent-wide extermination. And Auschwitz, with its isolated position, its railway access, and its expanding infrastructure, was selected to be the central hub. Rudolf Höss was called to Berlin and briefed directly by Himmler. His instructions were explicit. Auschwitz was to be transformed into the largest killing center in the Reich. Construction began immediately on the new camp at Birkenau. Massive barracks were raised, railway lines were extended, and designs were drafted for several crematoria, each with the capacity to dispose of thousands of bodies daily. Auschwitz was no longer merely a camp. It was becoming a factory of death. But during these initial months, even as the buildings were being sketched on paper, even as blueprints were circulated from one office to another, the people inside the camp lived their days in a haze of agony and unpredictability. For them, the world had shrunk to hunger, fear, and routine. Roll calls at sunrise, forced labor, random beatings, the bitter cold of winter, and the rampant sickness of summer. Names were erased, numbers were tattooed, and the very idea of a future was fragile. Many prisoners, particularly in these early years, were Polish intellectuals, Catholic priests, or resistance members. They sustained their spirits with songs, prayers, or whispered poems shared between bunks. And as death pervaded the barracks, some found subtle ways to resist by damaging tools, by sharing food, by documenting what they witnessed in hidden notes, buried beneath the barrack floors. Outside the camp, the SS continued their expansion. Workshops and factories were constructed. A synthetic rubber facility, Auschwitz III or Monowitz, was planned to aid the German war effort. Prisoners would be compelled to work for IG Farben, a chemical company that eagerly collaborated with the Nazis. These corporations profited from the slave labor, and in exchange, they built the infrastructure that facilitated the camp's growth. It was a terrifying fusion, industry, ideology, and genocide intertwined into a single operation. By the end of 1942, Auschwitz was no longer a location. It was a system, a complex web of camps, sub-camps, railways, guards, fences, and crematoria. And yet, for the outside world, the complete truth was still obscured. Whispers got out, rumors circulated, but the magnitude of the horror, the mechanization of murder, the sheer volume of death, all of it was beyond belief. Trains came, people disappeared, and the skies over Auschwitz, once clear and blue, became dark with the smoke from countless extinguished lives. As the sun continued its daily cycle over the Polish landscape, the metamorphosis of Auschwitz intensified in ways that would permanently scar the ground beneath it. The winds that once moved through trees and farmland now carried the indistinct echoes of shouted orders, the sharp sound of boots on gravel, and the low, persistent rumble of trains arriving at sidings. These trains were no longer just for transport. They were the lifelines of a horrific system, carrying thousands toward a destiny none could have truly conceived. In the first days of 1942, the trains started arriving with greater frequency. They originated from all over Europe, France, Slovakia, Belgium, the Netherlands, and soon from as far as Greece and Italy. Their occupants were Jewish people, branded as enemies, pariahs, and undesirables by the Nazi state. Crammed into cattle cars, without sustenance or water, they journeyed for days, packed so densely they could hardly breathe. Children cried, the elderly fainted. No one knew their precise destination, only that their homes were gone, and their existence had been reduced to darkness and heat, and the grinding of iron wheels on rails. At the camp, the facilities to process these human deliveries had been enlarged. The original Auschwitz I could no longer handle the volume, so focus shifted to Birkenau. Construction there had proceeded at a frantic rate. The level, marshy terrain had been drained. Barracks had been erected in rows, long, wooden, hastily constructed buildings, designed not for living but for containment. Electrified fences were put up in lines. Watchtowers punctuated the skyline, their dark shapes casting long shadows over the new camp. By mid-1942, Birkenau was functional. The first gas chambers, primitive buildings known as Bunkers 1 and 2, were already in operation. These were repurposed farmhouses, their interiors modified to facilitate mass murder. Victims were informed they were going to take showers, they were led inside, and then Zyklon B pellets were introduced through vents or holes in the roof. Death arrived in minutes. The rooms would be ventilated, and the bodies removed by Sonderkommando prisoners to be burned in adjacent pits. This method, though effective by Nazi criteria, was soon considered inadequate. It was too slow, too primitive. The SS desired something bigger, more streamlined. And so plans were sanctioned for the building of 4 new crematoria, each furnished with gas chambers and incinerators, engineered for high-capacity killing. These buildings, crematoria 2, 3, V, and V, would form the core of Auschwitz's extermination operation. They were located at the far side of Birkenau, near the tree line, concealed from plain sight. But for those disembarking at the camp, the long walk to these structures would soon become a final journey into nothingness. The conversion of Auschwitz into a death camp was not just a physical transformation, it was an administrative one. New departments were established. More guards were brought in, meticulous schedules and logbooks monitored arrivals, selections, work details, and fatalities. There were forms, rubber stamps, and signatures. Every step was documented. The Nazis, with a horrifying lack of emotion, approached genocide as a bureaucratic endeavor, a problem of logistics and resource management. To them, prisoners were digits, transports were data, and death was a target to be reached. Rudolf Höss, ever the efficient manager, made sure these targets were met. He personally supervised the expansion. He observed as the gas chambers were tested and as the crematoria ignited their first fires. He recorded efficiencies, made improvements, and filed his reports. In private, he documented that never in history had so many people been killed in such a brief period. Yet for the victims, none of it was a statistic. For those who disembarked from the trains, the world shrank to the sound of barking dogs, screamed commands in an alien language, and the disoriented shuffle of the crowd. SS officers stood on the railway platform, sorting people with a mere gesture of the hand, left or right, life or death. This procedure was known as selection. Women and children were often sent straight to the gas chambers. The physically capable were chosen for labor. Few grasped what was occurring until it was too late. Among the first Jewish people deported in large numbers to Auschwitz were those from Slovakia and France. In the spring and summer of 1942, They started arriving by convoy. Information filtered back to the ghettos and towns they had left, passed on by the rare escapee or in coded letters. But the full reality remained obscure. The Nazis had perfected the art of deception. Victims were informed they were being relocated for work. They were provided with transport manifests and told to bring their belongings. At the camp, signs directed them toward showers. The charade was kept up until the very last moment. Even inside the gas chambers, some held on to the hope that what they had been told might be true. And yet, the truth could not be concealed indefinitely. Rumors circulated across occupied Europe, in the ghettos of Warsaw and Białystok, in the Slovakian hills, in the safe houses of Paris. Whispers about Auschwitz began to spread. Something was happening there, something irreversible. Some attempted to dismiss it as hyperbole. Others could not face the possibility of it being true. But resistance groups took notice. Leaders in exile started to raise questions, and gradually a horrific realization began to form. The Germans were not just deporting the Jews, they were exterminating them. By late 1942 and into 1943, Auschwitz became the central point of the Nazi final solution. Transports arrived almost every day. The crematoria operated constantly. Thousands died daily. The camp was no longer just a location. It was a machine, a process, a system of industrialized death. Its components moved in a synchronized rhythm. The trains came, selections were conducted, bodies were incinerated, and ash was disposed of in the Vistula River or spread over nearby fields. The ground grew darker, the river turned grey, and still the smoke rose. For the SS, the killing became a routine. They ate their meals, wrote letters to their families, and shared jokes with their colleagues, all within earshot of the death machinery. Some rationalized their actions as duty. Others submerged their conscience in ideology. A few, it appears, grew to relish the power, and at the heart of it all was the calm, managerial cruelty of Rudolf Höss, an ordinary man who made murder efficient. Inside the barracks, the survivors held on. Disease was widespread: typhus, dysentery, tuberculosis. Food was minimal, sanitation was non-existent. Beatings were a daily occurrence. Roll calls went on for hours in rain or snow. And yet, even in the abyss of this suffering, some prisoners tried to hold on to fragments of their past selves. They told stories. They secretly taught lessons to children. They drew scenes from memory with stolen pencils on paper scraps. In their silence, they kept something the Nazis could not destroy: their humanity. Outside the camp, the Polish resistance started to collect information. Courageous messengers like Witold Pilecki infiltrated the camp and smuggled out comprehensive reports. His dispatches detailed the killings, the conditions, and the machinery of death. These reports were delivered to the Polish government in exile, to London, and to the Allies. And although such horrors were often met with disbelief, the truth was starting to emerge. Auschwitz was not just a camp. It was the pulsing heart of the Holocaust. By the close of 1943, over 1 million people had entered through its gates. The majority had not survived. The crematoria ran day and night. The piles of ash grew, and the very air carried a weight of sorrow too immense for words. But the full horror of Auschwitz was still to come. In the summer of 1944, the deportation of Hungarian Jews would bring a wave of victims so enormous that even the death machinery struggled to cope. Still, in these initial years, from the conversion of Polish barracks to the construction of gas chambers, the form of Auschwitz was already established. It was a place where ideology was turned into architecture, where hatred was systematized, where the boundary between normal life and industrial murder dissolved into dust and smoke. and although it started in quiet fields and humble buildings, its name would resonate through time as a symbol of the unimaginable. Auschwitz had emerged, and the world would be forever changed. At a casual glance, Auschwitz I, in contrast to the sprawling fields of Birkenau, did not look like a death camp. It appeared as a place of structure, a compound of gates, red brick barracks, neatly laid gravel paths, and orderly chimneys. The original site, once an old Polish military base, was reconfigured by the SS into something more deceptively methodical. The tidy rows of buildings and paved plazas hinted at discipline and order, but beneath that veneer of organization lay a universe of premeditated cruelty, a place where brutality was etched into the very bricks, and where silence was often a death sentence. It was here in Auschwitz I that the system of punishment and control was first perfected before mass extermination became the primary role of the Auschwitz complex. In the spring of 1940, before the gas chambers, before the crematoria towers cast their ash across the landscape, Auschwitz I functioned as a concentration camp in the most direct sense. Its purpose was to concentrate political adversaries, especially Poles who opposed the occupation, into a site of confinement and retribution. The initial transports brought men who were educators, clergy, government workers, students, and resistance members. Their offense was not a specific deed, but their identity. They were symbols of Polish culture and nationhood. And so they were arrested, given prisoner numbers, stripped of their names, and confined to barracks where survival was as much a matter of luck as of resilience. The architecture of Auschwitz I was crucial to the SS's capacity to control, punish, and dehumanize its prisoners. The layout was compact. Barracks stood side by side with narrow walkways between them. Fences enclosed the perimeter with guard towers looming above. At the main entrance stood the now infamous Iron Gate, displaying the lie that masked it all. Albeit macht frei, work sets you free. Those who entered beneath that gate soon realized that work did not bring freedom, but frequently led to death. Each building had a number, and each number a specific purpose. Block 10 was where medical experiments would later commence. Block 11 was the camp's jail, a grim, airless structure of solitary confinement cells, standing cells, and execution grounds. Between Block 10 and 11 was a courtyard where prisoners were regularly shot, often against a wall insulated with straw to deaden the sound. This was the death wall, and the ground beneath it grew heavy with blood and dread. Daily existence in Auschwitz I was an unceasing cycle of slave labor, roll calls, starvation, and punishment. Prisoners awoke at dawn, often in darkness, and were herded into the courtyard regardless of the weather. They stood in lines, sometimes for hours, as the SS shouted orders, counted and recounted, and punished errors with arbitrary beatings or executions. The barracks were severely overcrowded. Rooms intended for 50 housed hundreds. Straw mattresses were a luxury. Blankets were few. In winter, the barracks were frigid. In summer, they were suffocating. And throughout the year, disease thrived in the cramped conditions: typhus, lice, dysentery. Meals were minimal: black bread, thin soup, and a bitter coffee-like beverage. The caloric intake was insufficient. Prisoners wasted away, their bodies reduced to skin and bone. Hunger was a perpetual companion, gnawing, cruel, and relentless. Some traded their rations, some stole, some gave theirs to those weaker than themselves. But all were bound by the quiet desperation of starvation. The commandant, Rudolf Höss, governed the camp with a cold, systematic efficiency. He rarely shouted. He seldom displayed emotion. But under his leadership, Auschwitz I became a place where death was not merely a threat but a tool. Discipline was maintained not just with whips and firearms, but through systemic terror. Punishment cells in Block 11 were used extensively. Some were built to force inmates to stand in darkness for days, others lacked any ventilation. Those sentenced to these cells often did not leave alive. And then there were the gallows. Public hangings were organized as examples, warnings to others that resistance, escape, or sabotage would be met with immediate brutal retribution. Despite the immense suffering, prisoners did not always yield passively. Resistance, though fraught with danger, continued in small and brave forms. Prisoners exchanged information, damaged machinery, documented what they witnessed, and smuggled communications to the outside. The Polish underground was especially active, keeping in contact with the world beyond the fence. Some even attempted to escape. Few were successful, but every try served as a reminder that even in Auschwitz, the human spirit could not be entirely broken. SS guards patrolled the camp with unrestricted power. Some were ordinary men, once farmers, merchants, or office workers, now clad in black uniforms and equipped with rifles and clubs. Some were sadistic, notorious for their cruelty. Others insisted they were just following orders. Many lived in barracks next to the camp with their families nearby. Their daily lives were a grotesque juxtaposition to the lives of those they controlled, gardening, sharing meals, attending church just feet from where people were starving and dying. During this initial period, executions were still primarily carried out by shooting, hanging, or starvation. Zyklon B had only just started to be tested in small-scale trials, first in Block 11. In 1941, the first experimental gassing occurred using Soviet POWs and Polish prisoners. The test was a success by Nazi standards. The gas killed swiftly, with no blood or noise. It was efficient. In the basement of Block 11, SS men observed the results, took notes, and started to envision a wider use. These early tests signaled the start of a new chapter, but for now they were isolated and largely concealed. Meanwhile, the camp began to accept prisoners from outside Poland, Czechs, Yugoslavs, Germans classified as political opponents or homosexuals, and Jewish people who had been rounded up in ghettos throughout the general government. Though not yet the main focus of extermination, Jewish prisoners at Auschwitz I were subjected to the same brutal treatment: overwork, starvation, disease, and random executions. The camp, though not yet a mechanized death operation, was already a place where few survived for long. And yet, in the midst of this horror, sparks of humanity persisted. In secret, some prisoners conducted prayer services. Others made art with smuggled pieces of charcoal or ink. A clandestine newspaper was passed among inmates. And even in the dead of winter, when frostbite claimed fingers and breath hung heavy in the air, men and women still shared stories of home, of love, of freedom, memories that kept something vital alive inside them. The SS knew the psychological impact of Auschwitz and used it as a weapon. Punishment was frequently arbitrary, designed to eliminate any sense of reason or justice. Prisoners were forced to watch as others were beaten or hanged. Entire blocks were punished for the escape of one. Families, when they arrived as a unit, were separated without a word. Those selected for labor were dispatched to IG Farben's construction sites, often working to the point of collapse. Others worked within the camp, moving corpses, cleaning latrines, carrying bricks, or sorting through the possessions of the dead. Within Auschwitz, a hierarchy among prisoners, was enforced by the Nazis through the use of kapus, inmates appointed to supervisory positions over others. Some kapus were criminals, others political prisoners. Their behavior varied. Some were cruel in turn, while others tried to shield those under their charge. The system pitted prisoner against prisoner, fostering distrust and making unity more difficult. This too was intentional. Over time, the role of Auschwitz would change. As Birkenau assumed the primary role in mass extermination, Auschwitz continued as a center for administration, punishment, and smaller-scale executions. It became the command center of the camp complex, a place where decisions were made, orders were relayed, and new prisoners were registered and catalogued. The infamous Black Wall in the courtyard of Block 11 remained in use for executions, even as the crematoria of Birkenau operated ceaselessly in the distance. As 1943 began, the scale of Auschwitz's operations required further organization. The SS implemented new protocols. Prisoner numbers were tattooed on arms for easier tracking. Files were meticulously maintained. Lists of incoming transports were cross-referenced with labor requirements. Those considered unfit were sent directly to Birkenau's gas chambers. Those kept for labor were sent to subcamps, satellite facilities attached to Auschwitz I, where they manufactured weapons, dug foundations, and sustained German industry. Auschwitz I, though no longer the main site of death, remained steeped in suffering. It was the place where the first prisoners arrived, the place where the first experiments were conducted, the place where architecture and ideology merged into one. Every brick, every cell, every hallway bore witness to cries that would never be heard again. As the camp evolved into its monstrous form, Auschwitz I became more than just the initial node in a larger network. It turned into the administrative core of the entire Auschwitz complex. Here the SS commandant's offices were abuzz with the paperwork that commanded death. Ledgers documented arrivals and selections. Reports monitored the number of prisoners in each block. The logistics for incoming transports were organized with terrifying efficiency from these low buildings with their wooden desks and typewriters. The daily operations of genocide were handled like a routine enterprise. Paper clips secured death lists. Files held the names of the disappeared, and clerks in black uniforms sorted records that hid the mass extinction of life behind impersonal numbers. The presence of bureaucracy lent Auschwitz a distinct quality among concentration camps. In this place, everything was documented, even suffering. Medical reports described the effects of starvation on the human body. Execution orders were signed in ink, stamped, and filed away. Witness accounts discovered after the war verified how methodically everything was recorded, and through it all, the appearance of discipline was meticulously upheld. Even the executions were systematized, scheduled, and noted in logs. At the gallows, death was administered according to protocol. But beneath this chilling order, Auschwitz remained a savage place of punishment. One of the camp's most sinister locations was Block 10, where medical experiments were performed under the supervision of SS doctors. It was here that women, many of them Jewish or Roma, were subjected to sterilization trials, injections of mysterious substances, and invasive surgeries without anesthesia. These experiments were carried out under the guise of scientific progress, but were, in truth, acts of torture masked by the language of research. The women were confined to locked rooms, cut off from the rest of the camp, their screams often absorbed by thick walls or completely disregarded. Block 11, right next door, was equally dreaded, known as the camp within the camp. It was the site of severe disciplinary actions. Here, standing cells barely a meter square forced 4 prisoners at a time to remain standing all night in total darkness, unable to sit or lie down. In other cells, prisoners were left to starve with no food or water until death arrived slowly and unceremoniously. Executions took place at dawn, with prisoners marched into the courtyard, backs straight, eyes empty. Against the pock-marked wall of Block 11, many drew their last breath as rifles fired in unison. It was a place of quiet horror, where even hope learned to be silent. And yet, throughout this oppressive atmosphere of fear, some still found ways to defy it. An underground resistance network emerged within Auschwitz, comprising Polish soldiers, Jewish intellectuals, and other resilient individuals. They smuggled notes, drew maps, and documented atrocities. At great personal risk, they maintained records that would later be used as evidence against the SS. They passed information to new arrivals, warning them of dangers and helping them to survive their initial weeks. A few planned escapes, though the punishment for failure was severe. 10 or more prisoners were often executed for the flight of one. One of the most extraordinary acts of resistance was the infiltration by Witold Pilecki, a Polish officer who willingly allowed himself to be captured and sent to Auschwitz. From inside the camp, he gathered intelligence, established a resistance network, and smuggled out reports that detailed the early operations of the gas chambers and the abuses within the camp. Pilecki's courage stands as one of the most powerful testaments to the bravery that persisted even within the gates of Auschwitz. His reports made their way to the Polish underground and eventually to the Allied governments. Though disbelief and bureaucratic inertia dampened their immediate impact, life continued in a rigid pattern: roll calls, labor, soup lines, beatings, selections. The rhythm was only interrupted by death. Whether abrupt, like a bullet or a hanging, or gradual, like starvation and disease, death was a constant presence, like a persistent fog. And still, the camp continued to grow. New subcamps emerged. Monowitz, also known as Auschwitz III, was built to serve IG Farben and other industrial companies. There, prisoners worked in horrific conditions, building chemical plants, laying railways, and performing grueling labor from sunrise to sunset. Auschwitz I handled the paperwork, kept the records, and sent prisoners wherever the Reich demanded. The SS guards, many of them young men from German towns and villages, adjusted to the cruelty with startling ease. Some became increasingly brutal over time, their senses numbed by routine murder. Others justified their actions as their duty. Still others showed a shocking indifference. Female guards started arriving in 1942. Some, like Maria Mandel, gained a reputation for cruelty that matched their male counterparts. Prisoners dreaded their glance. A look or a gesture could seal one's fate. Outside the gates, the local Polish population watched the camp with silent fear. Smoke rose daily. The distant sounds of gunfire, barking dogs, and shouted commands drifted on the wind. Few dared to speak out, but the people of Oświęcim knew. They saw the trains. They heard the rumors. Some resisted quietly, hiding escapees, passing information, or delivering food. Others looked away, their own survival dependent on their silence. Back inside the camp, the physical deterioration of prisoners reflected their emotional breakdown. Backs were hunched from exhaustion. Eyes receded into hollow sockets. Fingers grew stiff from the cold. Yet in the darkest moments, kindness sometimes surfaced. A shared piece of bread, a whispered song, a stolen moment of prayer. These small acts defied the Nazi aim to obliterate identity and humanity. They were fragile reminders of the self that still existed beneath the number. As Auschwitz I entered 1944, its function began to contract. Birkenau had become the main killing center. Monowitz was focused on labor. But Auschwitz I kept its grim role as the hub, the control center, and the place where punishment was perfected. Executions continued, prisoners were tortured, and new arrivals were processed. The registration room saw thousands pass through, heads shaved, numbers tattooed, identities erased. Those who survived their first few weeks were never the same again. Even in these final stages of the war, the camp's routines persisted. As the Red Army advanced westward, the SS intensified their efforts. Punishments became more severe, executions grew more frequent, files were burned, evidence was concealed. But the bricks of Auschwitz I endured, and long after the fires of the crematoria had gone out, their silence would speak volumes. By the end of its operation, Auschwitz I had become more than just a prison. It was a blueprint, a model of cruelty, a place where architecture served oppression, where punishment was engineered, where evil wore a uniform and carried a clipboard. And even as Birkenau took more lives, even as the world began to grasp what was happening behind the barbed wire, Auschwitz I stood quietly at the center, its red brick saturated with history, with memory, with loss. For those who walked its paths, who slept on its wooden bunks, who faced its walls with trembling bodies, Auschwitz I was not simply the start of the complex, it was the soul of its system, and that soul was forged from pain. To the east of Auschwitz I, beyond the railway lines, and across the low, swampy terrain near the village of Brzezinka, a new concept was materializing, one based not on temporary punishment, but on permanent scale and extermination. It started as drawings on paper, blueprints spread across oak desks by SS engineers, drafted with a cold, sterile intent. This was not intended to be a camp for re-education or even labor. This was to be a location designed for mass murder. Its name would become Birkenau, though most would come to know it simply as Auschwitz II. Construction commenced in late 1941, initially under the guise that it would be for Soviet prisoners of war, but from the beginning its location and planned size hinted at something far more ambitious. The wetlands were drained, farmhouses were demolished, and villagers were forced out. The SS commandeered thousands of forced laborers, primarily Jews and Poles, to dig trenches, carry timber, and erect the long wooden barracks that would soon house tens of thousands. The land was muddy and flat, exposed to the weather, and during the Polish winter, it turned into a frozen, sucking bog. Workers succumbed to exhaustion. Many perished before the camp was even operational. The design of Birkenau was immense, covering over 400 acres. It would eventually be partitioned into several sectors: a men's camp, a women's camp, a family camp, a gypsy camp, quarantine areas, and hospital blocks. Each section had its own internal fences and gates, forming a labyrinth of confinement, but all were enclosed by a high perimeter of electrified barbed wire, punctuated by watchtowers placed at regular intervals like sentinels. From an aerial view, the camp looked like a grid, mathematically efficient, relentlessly systematic, and at its far end stood the crematoria, the final stop for most who entered. What distinguished Birkenau was its explicit, intentional design for industrialized killing. While Auschwitz I maintained the pretense of a labor camp, Birkenau was constructed to eliminate human life on a scale never before seen. The gas chambers were part of its original design. The crematoria were not additions but central elements engineered to run day and night. The SS referred to the entire system as the Endlösung, the final solution. In the summer of 1942, the first makeshift gas chambers, Bunkers 1 and 2, began operating. These were simple buildings, converted farmhouses, encircled by barbed wire, with their windows bricked up and fake showerheads installed on the ceilings. Victims were told they were being delosed. Inside, the doors were locked. Then SS men in gas masks dropped pellets of Zyklon B through openings in the roof. The bluish granules released hydrogen cyanide gas upon contact with air. Within minutes, the victims started to choke, convulse, and collapse. The silence that followed was not peace. It was the sound of a plan executed. After each gassing, Sonderkommando prisoners, Jewish men chosen and forced to assist in the killing process, were made to enter the chambers, remove the bodies, extract gold teeth, and cut hair from the corpses. The bodies were burned in open pits, the ashes scattered, or used as landfill. These men lived a life of terror and trauma, trapped between certain death and the impossible task of facilitating it. Most were killed within a few months to keep the secrets buried. As the rate of killing escalated, the SS looked for greater efficiency. Blueprints were created for 4 new crematoria. Crematoria 2, the Free, IV, each equipped with underground gas chambers and multi-muffle incinerators capable of burning thousands of bodies daily. The new facilities were designed by architects and engineers from Topf and Cerne, a German company that specialized in industrial furnaces. Their machines were installed with technical precision and tested for maximum capacity. They became the engines of Auschwitz's horror. By early 1943, Crematoria de Sucre and 3 were finished, soon followed by IV and V. Each structure included an undressing room, a gas chamber disguised as a shower facility, and a furnace hall where bodies were incinerated. The arrival process became more efficient. Trains pulled directly into the camp on a newly built spur line. Selections were conducted on the ramp. Those chosen for death were marched down a narrow path, later called the Road to Heaven, into the underground chambers. Most did not realize what was happening until the doors were sealed. From the outside, the camp seemed almost businesslike. Trains arrived, doors opened, orders were shouted. But within hours, entire communities were gone. Families, elders, children, whole villages from Hungary, France, the Netherlands, and Greece disappeared into the smoke. The efficiency was shocking, and the silence surrounding it was deafening. The construction of Birkenau also encompassed hundreds of prisoner barracks. Most were wooden stables originally meant for horses. Each was crammed with 3-tiered bunks, holding 700 to 1,000 prisoners, though designed for far fewer. The floors were muddy in winter and scorching in summer. The latrines were open trenches. Disease spread without check. Water was limited. Death from typhus, dysentery, and pneumonia was a daily event. Women were housed in separate sections, often in even more severe conditions. Sexual violence was common. Pregnant women were sent directly to the gas chambers. Mothers arriving with children were usually immediately selected for death. For those who survived longer, daily roll calls, beatings, starvation, and forced labor were their reality. Birkenau also had special sections, the Theresienstadt family camp, intended to mislead the outside world into believing that Jews were being resettled humanely, and the Gypsy camp, where thousands of Roma families were held before being murdered en masse in 1944. These areas were short-lived, either temporary illusions or holding pens before extermination. The atmosphere in Birkenau was different from Auschwitz I. It was louder, more chaotic, and more openly lethal. Where Auschwitz I had the cold efficiency of punishment, Birkenau screamed of extermination. The cries of infants, the wails of mothers, the barking of guards, the hiss of gas, the roar of fire, these were the sounds that enveloped the camp in dread. Despite the horror, signs of resistance began to appear. Some Sonderkommando risked everything to document what they saw, hiding photographs and testimonies in the ash pits. Inmates carved notes into walls or buried jars with witness accounts under the barracks. In 1944, The Sonderkommando uprising would erupt into brief, desperate violence, but those early seeds of defiance were already being planted. The scale of Birkenau was staggering. Over 1 million people were murdered there, the vast majority of them Jews. Their names, once spoken with love in homes across Europe, were replaced by numbers or forgotten entirely. The ash from their bodies drifted over fields, settled in rivers, and became part of the land. Birkenau consumed them not only in death but in memory, until survivors, historians, and the ruins themselves started to speak for them. And still, the killing went on. As 1943 turned to 1944, and the transports from Hungary began, Birkenau's machinery would enter its most intense phase. In the meantime, the camp stood, its chimneys belching black smoke, its wires humming, its platforms echoing with footsteps, waiting for the next train, the next number, the next life to be erased. By early 1944, Birkenau had become the largest killing center in the Nazi Empire. Its gas chambers and crematoria functioned with mechanical regularity. The new rail spur, finished in May, allowed entire transports to be delivered directly into the heart of the camp. This new arrangement meant greater speed, fewer opportunities for confusion or resistance, and far more victims arriving and being exterminated within a matter of hours. It was during this period that the machinery of murder reached its most horrific peak. During the deportation of Hungarian Jews, in just 10 weeks from May to July 1944, more than 430,000 Hungarian Jews were sent to Auschwitz, most to Birkenau. The vast majority were directed straight to the gas chambers upon arrival. The SS, under the command of Adolf Eichmann, and with logistical support from Hungarian authorities, organized this operation with brutal efficiency. At its height, the trains arrived day and night. They brought families from towns and villages all over Hungary, places like Debrecen, Szeged, and Kaposvár. Many had been held in ghettos for only a short time before the final transport began. The ramp at Birkenau became a scene of heartbreak. Families disembarked from the trains, squinting in the light, holding bundles of clothes and photographs. They were met by SS doctors and guards who performed the selection process in mere seconds. To one side, the able-bodied, mostly young men and women, were sent to labor. To the other, the elderly, the sick, children, and mothers with small children were sent to the gas chambers. The illusion was preserved. They were told to leave their luggage, to remember where it was, that they would be reunited after a shower. The chimneys were visible in the background, but few dared to imagine their purpose. At the peak of the Hungarian operation, the crematoria could not handle the volume of bodies. To manage the overflow, large open-air pits were dug behind the crematoria. Bodies were burned in piles. The smell of burning flesh and hair pervaded the sky. Ash rained down over the fields. Eyewitnesses, even from outside the camp, described a black haze that seemed to hang over the area. It was as if the very sky was bearing witness to what the world refused to see. The Sonderkommando units, composed of Jewish prisoners forced to carry out the work of extermination, were overwhelmed. These men endured a unique form of agony. They handled the bodies of their own people, sometimes their own friends, their own families. They dragged corpses from gas chambers, sorted valuables, and fed the furnaces. Their existence was consumed by death, and they knew they would not survive. The Nazis regularly killed Sonderkommando members to prevent word of the operation from getting out. Despite this, a remarkable act of resistance took shape. Over months, secret plans were made, crude weapons were crafted, notes were smuggled, and maps were drawn. Female prisoners in the munitions factories smuggled gunpowder, grain by grain, hidden in hems and hair. These small amounts of powder were secretly passed to the Sonderkommando. On October 7, 1944, they launched their attack. The uprising started at Crematorium 4. Prisoners assaulted guards, set the building on fire, and tried to destroy the killing facility. Some attempted to escape, others fought back. The SS responded swiftly and with overwhelming force. The rebellion was crushed. Over 450 prisoners were killed in retaliation, but the crematorium was damaged and never fully repaired. The uprising, though unsuccessful, was an act of incredible courage, a moment when those trapped in the machinery of death chose to resist, if only to assert their dignity in their final moments. By the end of 1944, the SS knew the war was lost. The Soviet Red Army was advancing from the west. Rumors spread through the camp, hope flickered among the prisoners. Even as the killings continued, the Nazis began to destroy the evidence. Files were burned, buildings were demolished, crematoria were blown up, and ash pits were filled in. The machinery that had operated day and night for over 2 years was being erased, but the damage could not be reversed. Birkenau was steeped in blood and memory. No explosion could erase that. Even as the Nazis tried to hide the truth, they continued to kill. In November 1944, gassings were officially stopped, more due to the approaching Soviets than any change of heart. Yet executions went on. Prisoners were forced on death marches westward into Germany and Austria, many dying along the way. Birkenau, once filled with the cries of the dying, gradually grew quiet. The camp's final days were a mix of chaos and cruelty. The SS tried to eliminate all remaining evidence of the mass killings. Thousands of prisoners, those still considered strong, were forced to march out into the freezing cold with little food or clothing toward camps like Bergen-Belsen and Dachau. Many collapsed in the snow. Those who fell behind were shot. When the Red Army finally arrived on January 27, 1945, they discovered a landscape of silence. Birkenau was mostly deserted. The gas chambers had been demolished, but signs of horror were everywhere. Ash covered the fields. Bones protruded from the soil. Clothing, shoes, and suitcases lay in heaps. The barracks still stood, their bunks filled with skeletal figures barely alive. Survivors staggered out, blinking in the sunlight. They had no energy to cheer, only quiet tears. Among the discoveries were the remnants of the extermination process, canisters of Zyklon B, crematorium ruins, prisoner records, mounds of hair, glasses, prosthetic limbs, and children's shoes. These objects would later become haunting symbols of the Holocaust. But at Birkenau, they were not symbols, they were remains. Birkenau did not start as a death camp. It was built piece by piece, designed, expanded, and perfected by men with plans and pencils. But it became the epicenter of the Holocaust, the most efficient killing site in history. Over 1.1 million people were murdered there, 90% of them Jews. The rest were Poles, Roma, Soviet POWs, and others deemed unworthy by Nazi ideology. What made Birkenau so terrifying was not just the scale of death, but the cold efficiency with which it was managed. It was not chaos. It was not frenzy. It was organized, planned, documented, and executed with the same detachment one might use to build a road or run a factory. And that is what lingers most in the memory of Birkenau, the silence of its systems, the bureaucratic quiet that lay beneath the screams. And when it was all over, when the smoke cleared and the ash settled, Birkenau remained. The fences rusted, the chimneys crumbled, the rails grew cold, but its story endured, not only in the testimonies of survivors, but in the very earth itself. The fields still hold the traces of footsteps. The soil still bears the dust of the dead. The sky, once blackened with smoke, still remembers. Inside the gas chambers and crematoria, at the far end of Auschwitz-Birkenau, past the wooden barracks and skeletal fences, stood the structures that embodied the camp's terrible purpose. 4 low concrete buildings, set into the earth like wounds. Their exteriors offered little clue as to what was inside. To the uninformed observer, they might have looked like factories or storage buildings. But these were the gas chambers and crematoria. Crematoria 2, W3, IV, and V. Structures meticulously engineered, not for labor but for extermination. They were not primitive instruments of war. They were architectural declarations of genocide, shaped by blueprints and driven by the cold precision of engineering. Each crematorium followed a methodical layout. The victims first entered undressing rooms, large, dimly lit chambers where they were instructed to get naked. SS guards, sometimes aided by prisoner functionaries, told them to hang their clothes carefully and remember their hook number. They were informed they were going to take a shower, that disinfection was required, that they would be reunited with their families shortly. The calmness of this lie was crucial. Panic would disrupt the flow. Obedience kept it smooth. After undressing, the victims were guided down a hallway and into the gas chamber. The room was designed to look like a communal shower, long and low-ceilinged with fake shower heads attached to the ceiling. The walls were bare, the floor poured concrete. Nozzles and small grates were set into the space. Some chambers could hold up to 2,000 people at once. The doors shut with a metallic thud. Once the chamber was sealed, SS men, often under the supervision of officers like SS Hauptscharführer Moll, or assisted by trained orderlies, released Zyklon B pellets through hatches in the roof or wall vents. The pellets, a cyanide-based pesticide, released deadly gas when exposed to the atmosphere. Within moments the air turned toxic. Victims began to suffocate. Their lungs burned. Panic erupted. The stronger ones climbed over the weaker, clawing at the doors and walls, desperate for air that would never arrive. Death usually took between 10 and 20 minutes. The duration depended on the number of people inside, the temperature of the chamber, and the distribution of the gas. Guards observed the process through small glass peepholes in the doors. They watched until the screaming ceased, until the chamber fell silent. Once the chamber was considered cleared, large ventilation fans were activated to remove the lingering gas. Then came the Sonderkommando, Jewish prisoners forced to perform the gruesome work that followed. Wearing masks, they entered the chamber, often walking on top of heaps of the dead. They untangled the bodies, which were frequently locked in twisted embraces or piled in corners. Their job was to extract gold teeth, cut the hair from female victims, and search the corpses for hidden jewelry or valuables. The bodies were then moved to the incineration rooms, either by elevator in Crematoria 2 and the 3, or directly in Crematoria 5 and V. The ovens manufactured by Topf and Söhne were capable of burning hundreds of bodies each day. Each furnace had multiple muffles, individual chambers where bodies were inserted in groups. Fire and forced air sped up the process. The ashes were later ground, sifted for gold remnants, and dumped into rivers, ponds, or spread across fields. The crematoria ran day and night. Their chimneys constantly spewed smoke. Guards often joked that the smoke indicated how many pieces had been processed that day. The terminology was intentional. Pieces instead of people, material instead of bodies, action instead of murder. This language sanitized the reality for the perpetrators, turning death into a routine. The entire system, from train arrival to ash disposal, was choreographed to maintain control. Prisoners were given as little time as possible to comprehend their fate. Their luggage was collected and sorted in warehouses nicknamed Canada, where stolen goods were stacked in mountains: suitcases, eyeglasses, shoes, kitchenware, toys. Items that once had meaning were now stripped of context and piled up as inventory. These warehouses, staffed by prisoners, were part of the camp's bizarre ecosystem. Alongside the crematoria, they represented a second wave of exploitation, the conversion of victims into economic value. Gold was melted into bars, hair was baled and sent to German factories to be used in textiles, clothing was sorted and redistributed. The Nazis left nothing untouched. At the center of this entire operation were the SS engineers, doctors, guards, and bureaucrats who fine-tuned the process. They tested ventilation rates, adjusted pellet quantities, and reviewed cremation times. In internal memos, they debated the most effective way to stack bodies inside the muffles. One document discovered after the war discussed the ideal mix of fat and lean corpses to ensure efficient burning. Even in genocide, efficiency was the main principle. Rudolf Höss, returning briefly to Auschwitz in 1944 to oversee the Hungarian transports, expressed pride in the system's performance. He later wrote that no other extermination center had matched Auschwitz in its capacity or speed. His tone was one of cold accomplishment, as if he were speaking of a well-run factory rather than a site of unimaginable horror. Yet for those trapped within the walls of the gas chambers, the process was anything but orderly. The moments before death were chaos. Mothers held their children tight, families huddled together in terror. Some sang prayers, some screamed, some stood in stunned silence, unable to process the truth. And when the gas came, it did not discriminate. It killed quickly, violently, and absolutely. The Sonderkommando witnessed this daily. Some, compelled by conscience, kept secret diaries or testimonies buried in canisters near the crematoria. These texts, recovered after the war, described not only the mechanisms of murder, but also the emotional devastation of those forced to assist in it. They wrote of numbness, of despair, of moments where the human spirit flickered, when a child smiled before entering, or a mother whispered a final blessing. These memories haunted them, and for most they would never find peace. In October 1944, Crematorium 4 was damaged during the Sonderkommando revolt, and never returned to full operation. In the months that followed, as the Red Army advanced, the remaining crematoria were used less frequently, but for over 2 years they had served as the heart of Auschwitz's killing system. Every brick, pipe, vent, and bolt bore witness. Every wall held the echoes of screams that no longer came. As the Nazis prepared to abandon the camp in January 1945, they dynamited the crematoria to hide the evidence. The roofs of the gas chambers collapsed. The ovens were shattered, but even in ruins the story was clear. The layout remained, the pipes, the doors, the twisted steel frames. The ghost of the system lingered. And so what had begun as a concept, a technical solution to mass murder, had become a reality, not a metaphor, not an exaggeration, but a place where people were killed, not in rage, but in a process. The gas chambers and crematoria of Auschwitz-Birkenau were not only instruments of genocide, they were the embodiment of it. Inside the barbed wire confines of Auschwitz, the camp was more than a single entity. It was a constellation of cruel separations. Men and women were segregated into different sectors. Jewish people were kept apart from other prisoners. Romani families were confined to their own section. There were barracks for forced laborers, for punishment, for quarantine, for victims of experiments. The camp was a fractured world, where one's location, number, and assigned category could determine the difference between prolonged survival and immediate extermination. And for those not sent to the gas chambers, upon arrival, life inside the camp became a daily ordeal, a slow wearing away of the body, the mind, and the soul. In this brutal system, The daily rhythm of survival started before sunrise. Loud whistles pierced the cold air. Inmates awoke from overcrowded bunks where they had slept 5 or more to a wooden plank, huddled together for warmth. Some hadn't slept at all, tormented by pain, fever, or the constant itching of lice. They rose in darkness, bones aching, stomachs empty. There was no breakfast, only a tin cup of lukewarm liquid that passed for coffee, distributed in chipped and dirty mugs. Some drank it slowly, others gulped it down. Then came roll call, or appel, the heart of the camp's control mechanism. Prisoners lined up outside their barracks, row after row, regardless of the weather. Rain, snow, wind, heat. It made no difference. They stood for hours, sometimes from dawn until noon, waiting as SS guards counted and recounted, looking for anyone who might have died during the night or attempted to escape. If a prisoner was missing, the roll call would drag on indefinitely, with punishment inflicted on the entire block. The sick were forced into line. The dead were propped upright between living bodies. No movement was permitted, and if a prisoner fainted or collapsed, they were beaten, or worse. After roll call came work. Labor was mandatory, regardless of a prisoner's condition. The camp administration kept a detailed list of work assignments. Some were sent to construction sites or industrial plants, like IG Farben at Monowitz. Others shoveled snow, hauled stones, unloaded trains, or pushed wheelbarrows until their legs failed. Still others worked inside the camp, cleaning latrines, digging trenches, or sorting the possessions of the murdered. The term Arbeitsdienst, or work duty, became synonymous with pain. Prisoners were marched out in columns, often several kilometers through snow or mud, to satellite work locations. Guards followed with rifles and barking dogs. The pace was relentless. Those who stumbled were hit. Those who fell were left behind, sometimes shot on the spot. The roads around Auschwitz were littered with corpses in winter, bodies frozen where they fell, never collected. Food was scarce, designed to keep prisoners just barely alive. A watery soup, often made from turnips or spoiled cabbage, was served at midday. In the evening, a crust of bread, perhaps with a smear of margarine or a slice of sausage, if the prisoner was fortunate. Hunger gnawed at the mind constantly. Prisoners fought over crumbs. Some traded pieces of bread for a cigarette, a favor, or a scrap of information. Stomachs shrank, ribs pressed against skin, the body consumed itself. Disease flourished in every corner. Typhus, spread by lice, was rampant. Dysentery, untreated and unchecked, quickly wasted prisoners. Tuberculosis, pneumonia, and skin infections were common and rarely treated. There was a hospital block, but admission often meant a death sentence. Medical supplies were scarce. Doctors, many of them prisoners themselves, were powerless. An SS selection regularly swept through the hospital, taking the weakest for special treatment, which meant death. Sanitation was non-existent. Toilets were wooden benches with holes, used by dozens at once. There was no privacy, no soap, no clean water. The stench of excrement and sickness hung thick in the air. Insects swarmed in summer. Cold settled in the bones during winter. Prisoners were given thin uniforms, no socks, and wooden clogs without soles. Their skin cracked and bled. Frostbite turned fingers black, feet rotted, and still they worked. And yet within this nightmare, moments of humanity flickered. Prisoners formed bonds, shared advice, and taught each other how to survive a little longer, how to avoid punishment, where to find scraps of food, who to trust, and who to fear. Friendships, however fragile, took root. A word of comfort, a gesture of kindness, these became rare, precious things. Among the prisoners, a hierarchy existed. Some wore green triangles, criminals, who were often assigned as capus, the prisoner overseers who carried whips and wielded power. Others wore red triangles, marking them as political enemies. Jews wore yellow stars, sometimes combined with red or black triangles. Romani prisoners had black or brown patches. Homosexuals wore pink. This color-coded system allowed the SS to manipulate prisoner divisions, fostering mistrust and rivalry. Some capus were cruel, enforcing discipline with zeal. Others tried to protect those under them at great personal risk. Women faced additional layers of suffering. In the women's camp at Birkenau, conditions were even harsher. Pregnant women were often sent to gas chambers immediately. Those who gave birth in secret sometimes saw their infants drowned or torn from them. Female prisoners were subjected to sexual violence, assaulted by SS guards, or used in forced brothels at other camps. They also endured sterilization experiments and so-called gynecological research carried out by Nazi doctors. Despite this, women formed tightly knit networks of support. They shared rations, nursed the sick, and braided each other's hair to keep lice away. Some smuggled notes, bits of paper or thread to make small acts of resistance, embroidered messages hidden in clothing, or coded prayers sewn into collars. The children, few as they were, suffered most of all. Most Jewish children were killed upon arrival. A small number, often twins, all those selected for experiments, were housed in special barracks. Joseph Mengele, the infamous SS doctor, became obsessed with these children, particularly twins, using them for medical tests that defied reason. He was known to arrive smiling, handing out sweets, only to conduct horrific procedures hours later: blood draws, amputations, surgeries without anesthesia. Some children died during the experiments, others were killed afterward. Hope in Auschwitz was a fragile thing. It came in brief glimpses, a whispered rumor of Allied victories, a Red Cross parcel smuggled in, a letter that somehow slipped through the censors. Songs were sung under breath. Poems were composed and recited in the darkness. One prisoner crafted chess pieces from bread. Another kept a diary on scraps hidden under the floorboards. These small acts became lifelines, reminders of who they had been before the wire, the uniform, the number. And there were escapes, rare but real. Some prisoners slipped away during work details. Others forged documents, disguised themselves, or bribed guards. A few succeeded. Many were caught. Punishment was severe, not only for the escapee, but for their entire block. Collective retribution meant that dozens might die for the flight of one. Still, the desire for freedom never vanished entirely. For the vast majority, survival meant silence, obedience, and endurance. Days bled into one another, marked only by the rhythms of hunger and fear. And yet, even in such a place, people remembered songs, recipes, family stories, names, dates, holidays. They carved them into wood, whispered them to each other, and passed them on like sacred relics. Auschwitz was built to destroy the body and erase the soul. But in the most hidden corners, in the quiet glances, the held hand, the shared crust of bread, something resisted, not loud, not triumphant, but enduring. As the camp continued to grow and its routines became more entrenched, the lines between mere survival and the slow loss of self blurred. For those who endured the monotony of pain, the repetition of suffering, and the erosion of identity, time itself took on a strange, suspended quality. There were no weeks or weekends, no seasons celebrated or birthdays marked. There was only the next roll call, the next meal, if it came, the next blow, the next breath. The days passed with such grinding sameness that many prisoners ceased to hope for anything beyond the moment. Their thoughts narrowed. Their focus became immediate: a crust of bread, a dry patch of wood to sit on, a guard in a better mood, a chance to avoid the next selection. But even in this fog of routine, the divisions between prisoners shaped every interaction. Political prisoners, often better organized, formed underground networks. They shared information, protected the weak when possible, and maintained some shred of dignity through secret acts of solidarity. Polish prisoners, many of whom had been in Auschwitz since the early days, sometimes worked as translators or clerks, and were able to help newcomers understand the rules that governed survival. Among Jews, the sense of doom was sharper. They knew, often from the moment of arrival, that they had been brought to Auschwitz not to serve but to die. Still, pockets of life persisted. In the men's camp, some prisoners scratched poems into walls or carved chessboards into bunks. One man, a former violinist, constructed a crude instrument and played it softly at night, the notes drifting over the heads of those trying to sleep. In the women's camp, lullabies were hummed in whispers, small rituals were observed, prayers spoken in secret. These things had no power to change their fate, but they offered a glimmer of memory, of identity, of resistance against being reduced to nothing more than a number. And numbers were everywhere, tattooed on forearms, written on barracks rosters, scrolled in death registers. The loss of names was one of the first and most devastating forms of dehumanization. New prisoners were no longer called by the names their mothers had spoken with love, but by 5 or 6 digits barked out by guards. This reduction became internalized over time. Prisoners began referring to themselves and others by number, not because they wanted to, but because it was safer, easier, necessary. Some prisoners were given assignments that kept them close to the camp's administration. Clerks, storekeepers, translators. These positions offered slightly better conditions, sometimes even a little more food, but they came at a cost. These prisoners often witnessed the internal workings of the Nazi machine up close, saw the lists, the schedules, the orders. They read the names of those scheduled for execution, the transports arriving, the counts of the dead. For them, survival meant becoming part of the machinery, even as it devoured their people. Others were assigned to what were known as penal companies, or strafkommandos. These were groups of prisoners sentenced to especially grueling or dangerous work, either as punishment or because they were considered expendable. They dug ditches, carried bricks, hauled corpses. Most died within weeks. The brutality they endured was unparalleled. For Romani prisoners, the conditions were distinct and tragic. Entire families were placed together in what was officially known as the Zigeunerlager, or gypsy camp. Children played in the mud, while parents worked, watched, and hoped. At first, the presence of family gave a faint sense of normalcy, until disease tore through the camp and selections began. In August 1944, the entire Romani camp was liquidated. In a single night, thousands were taken to the gas chambers. Few survived. Auschwitz also hosted a brief, cruel illusion: the Theresienstadt family camp. Czech Jewish families were brought in and allowed to live together in better conditions, with occasional access to mail and the freedom to stage plays or concerts. But this was a deception meant to be shown to visiting observers. After 6 months, nearly all the inmates were murdered. Their performances and letters were used as tools of propaganda. Amid this torment, some prisoners managed to leave behind words, diaries, scraps of testimony, letters never sent, written in margins on stolen paper, in code. These fragments, later discovered in walls, in ash pits, or buried beneath barracks, offer us glimpses into the emotional lives of those who suffered. They reveal love and longing, anger and despair, but also a determination to be remembered, to be more than a number, to leave behind something that told the truth. The SS guards, meanwhile, became numb to the suffering they inflicted. Many had begun their assignments at Auschwitz with reluctance or even discomfort, but over time they adjusted. Routine dulled their morality. Orders replaced conscience. Some became sadistic, taking pleasure in cruelty. Others simply looked away. Only a rare few ever showed mercy, and fewer still ever spoke out. As 1944 gave way to 1945, a chill settled over the camp, not just from winter, but from the knowledge that time was running short. Rumors swirled of advancing Soviet forces. Some prisoners clung to hope, others feared a final massacre. In these last weeks, survival took on a new urgency. The crematoria burned constantly. Executions increased. Records were destroyed. Evidence was hidden. For those still alive, each day was a triumph of will. Their bodies were frail, shadows of what they once were. Their minds were scarred, but something still beat within them. A heart, a whisper, a fragment of self. When the Red Army finally approached the camp in January 1945, most of Auschwitz's inmates were forced out on death marches. Thousands died in the snow, collapsing from exhaustion, starvation, or bullets. Those left behind were the sick, the dying, the ones the SS deemed not worth the effort to move. And yet some lived. When liberation came, they were barely recognizable as human, emaciated, weak, covered in lice and rags. But their eyes still carried something, a memory, a story, a life that the Nazis had tried and failed to extinguish, because even within the camp's relentless brutality, even in a world constructed for death, something human remained in whispered prayers, in stolen smiles, in fingers held tightly through the night. Auschwitz was not merely a camp, it was a universe of pain, precision, and endurance. Its divisions, its routines, its violence were calculated to erase the soul, but they did not succeed entirely. Amid the screams and silence, life persisted. Within the shadowed labyrinth of Auschwitz-Birkenau, where death came by gas, by bullet, by starvation and disease, there was a different kind of horror, quieter, more clinical, but no less devastating. In one corner of the camp, marked by steel gates and sterile rooms, lived a man whose name would come to symbolize the fusion of science and sadism. His name was Joseph Mengele. To some, he was simply the doctor. To others, he was the angel of death. His presence was not loud or violent, but rather meticulous, composed, and disturbingly calm. He carried himself with the polished confidence of a gentleman, a man of culture and education. But beneath the crisp uniform and courteous smile lay a mind consumed by obsession, one that saw Auschwitz not merely as a camp of death, but as a living laboratory. Mengele arrived at Auschwitz in May 1943, already in his early 30s and holding doctorates in both medicine and anthropology. He had studied under renowned academics in Frankfurt and believed firmly in Nazi racial ideology. His scientific interests were focused on heredity and genetics, especially on how racial traits could be preserved, isolated, or manipulated. He found in Auschwitz the perfect place to conduct his work, where tens of thousands of lives were reduced to raw material. He was stationed at the women's and family camps in Birkenau, where his selections on the ramp were just the beginning. While other doctors might wave a hand indifferently, Mengele's process was precise. He looked closely at twins, dwarfs, and individuals with physical abnormalities. These were not people to him. They were specimens, candidates, opportunities. When a new transport arrived, he often appeared in full uniform, even during rain or snow. Meticulously groomed, his boots were always polished, his gloves always clean. Twins fascinated Mengele. They represented a natural control group for his experiments. If one twin received a treatment and the other did not, he believed he could observe changes more clearly. Sets of twins were separated from the rest upon arrival. Most were children, small, frightened, clutching each other's hands. They were taken not to the gas chambers, but to a special block under his command. At first, the children were relieved to have escaped death. They were given extra food, warmer clothing, even sweets. Mengele himself was often kind to them, speaking gently, stroking their hair, but it was all part of the deception. Inside his laboratories, the experiments began. He measured their limbs, recorded eye color, took blood samples, X-rays were performed. Spinal taps were administered. Injections of unknown substances were given without explanation. Some children were sewn together, their veins and organs fused in grotesque attempts to artificially create conjoined twins. Many died from infection or shock. When one twin died, the other was often killed shortly afterward, so that comparative autopsies could be conducted. He kept detailed records, often sketching his observations with scientific detachment. He did not appear cruel in the way a torturer might. He appeared engaged, fascinated, as though he were solving a puzzle. For him, morality had been erased by ideology. The children were not human. They were data. Other victims included individuals with physical deformities, Roma, and those afflicted with conditions like heterochromia, different colored eyes. He was especially intrigued by eye color, hoping to unlock the secret to manipulating it genetically. Eyes from murdered victims were preserved in jars, organs were dissected, and limbs were amputated. Some prisoners were subjected to extreme heat or cold, others to sterilization procedures. Many of these experiments were performed without anesthesia. In the Roma camp, Mengele roamed freely, selecting subjects for mass blood draws. Children were bled to the point of collapse. Some were injected with infectious diseases just to observe their reactions. He took careful notes. He laughed sometimes during procedures. Prisoners reported seeing him hum classical music as he worked. His coldness was not in violence but in absence, in his total detachment from suffering. His victims called him Uncle Mengele. To the children, especially in the beginning, he seemed protective, but his kindness always had strings. And once the experiments began, the truth emerged. Survivors recalled how his mood could change in a breath. One moment he might pat a child on the head. The next he would order their sibling to be taken for dissection. Despite the horror, some of the children formed deep bonds with each other. They held hands during injections, whispered stories at night, and comforted those who cried. A few even tried to protect younger children by pretending to be their twins. But nothing escaped Mengele's eye. He counted them carefully. He knew each name, each face. For the prisoners assigned to assist him, often Jewish doctors and nurses, the position was a moral torment. They tried to ease pain, to shield patients where possible, but they were forced to participate. Refusal meant death. These men and women bore witness to unspeakable acts and carried the guilt for the rest of their lives. Mengele's influence extended beyond the laboratory. He had access to every area of the camp. His selections could send thousands to death or grant temporary reprieve. He moved through Auschwitz like a shadow, always watching, always deciding. His power was absolute, and he wielded it with eerie composure. When liberation neared in January 1945, Mengele fled the camp. He took with him documents, but much was left behind. The children he experimented on were among the last to be liberated. Some survived, most did not. His office was found with notes, samples, and preserved organs, but much of the documentation had been destroyed. Mengele escaped justice. He eluded capture for decades, living under false identities in South America. He died in 1979, never tried, never punished. His crimes, however, lived on in the memories of those who survived, and in the stories of those who didn't. His legacy is not one of discovery or progress, but of cruelty masquerading as science. The sterile rooms, the neat charts, the gloved hands, all served a singular purpose: to inflict pain in pursuit of a twisted ideal. Auschwitz was his laboratory, and its victims were the evidence. After the war, the world would try to comprehend how a doctor, trained to heal, to preserve life, could become an architect of so much pain. But within the gates of Auschwitz, Joseph Mengele was not seen as a paradox. He was simply another cog in the machinery of death, albeit one cloaked in the sterile language of science. He had no need to shout, no need to beat or scream. His authority lay in his clipboard, his white coat, and the haunting certainty with which he chose who would live and who would die. Even among the SS, Mengele was viewed with a kind of eerie reverence. He was intelligent, charming, fluent in several languages, and impeccably groomed. He played the role of a cultured gentleman with ease, discussing art, music, and literature before returning to his lab to dissect a child. It was this calm duality that disturbed so many survivors. He did not appear like a monster. He appeared ordinary, polite, even, and yet the suffering he caused was immense. His obsession with twins was not merely academic. He believed they held the key to solving what he saw as the greatest challenge to the Nazi vision of racial purity: heredity. Could Aryan traits be manipulated or preserved across generations? Could disease be bred out? Could a master race be engineered, not merely selected? These were the questions that drove him. Auschwitz gave him thousands of test subjects, without consent, without oversight, without consequence. The daily routine in his children's block was a bizarre contradiction. In the mornings, twins were measured, photographed, and examined. Their growth charts were updated, their dental arches traced. In the afternoons, they played with toys, drew pictures, or listened to records. They were fed slightly better meals than the average prisoner, and they lived in heated quarters. But at night, the experiments resumed. Some children were injected with typhus or tuberculosis. Others were subjected to limb amputations, forced organ removals, or surgical experiments performed without anesthetic. Many of these procedures were designed to test pain thresholds or the progression of disease. Others had no clear scientific purpose at all, only cruelty under the guise of research. A few twins survived. After the war, they gave testimony, describing how they clung to one another, how they whispered to keep each other brave, how some cried not for themselves, but for their siblings. One survivor recalled being forced to watch as her twin was dissected on a metal table. Another described how when one child died during a procedure, Mengele would smile faintly and make notes, as if observing a broken machine. One of the more haunting details was his use of colored ink. Mengele catalogued each child meticulously: red for death, blue for experimental subjects, black for twins already dissected. The colors, sharp and clean on the paper, belied the messiness of what was done to the bodies they represented. In his eyes, these were data points, deviations, nothing more. Beyond the twins, his experiments on Romani children and women were equally horrific. He often targeted those with rare genetic traits: albinism, cleft palates, dwarfism. For many, the selection into his care was mistaken as a reprieve, but few ever left his block alive. Survivors remembered the hallway outside his office, lined with glass jars, organs suspended in liquid, eyes floating like marbles, reminders that their bodies were no longer their own. Mengele's medical staff included prisoner doctors and nurses, many of them Jewish physicians stripped of their licenses, their dignity, their families. Some complied out of fear. Others resisted in subtle ways, diluting medications, mislabeling files, or sabotaging procedures. They lived with unbearable guilt, often performing tasks that went against everything they had once sworn to uphold. They watched children die and could do little to stop it. They cried when no one could see. Despite the secrecy, word of Mengele's experiment spread through the camp. Whispers passed from barrack to barrack of the man with the monocle, the clipboard, the soft voice of the twins who vanished, of the children who screamed through the walls. For many, the mere mention of his name was enough to silence a conversation. He was not only feared, he was incomprehensible. In the chaos of Auschwitz's final days, Mengele destroyed much of his documentation. He burned charts, shredded files, and left only fragments behind. But he escaped untouched, blending into the crowd of retreating SS. He traveled west, eventually reaching South America with the help of underground Nazi networks. For decades, he lived under aliases in Argentina, Paraguay, and Brazil. Despite multiple investigations and sightings, he was never captured. He died in 1979, reportedly of a stroke while swimming in Brazil. His grave was marked under a false name. Only years later was his identity confirmed by forensic analysis. He had lived out his life in freedom, never held accountable. For survivors, this was a bitter truth, that justice did not always find its way, that some evils vanish into the fog. Yet Mengele's crimes did not disappear. They lived on in testimony, in memories, in the physical scars borne by those he touched. His name became a symbol not just of medical abuse, but of what can happen when ideology strips away empathy, when science loses its soul, when power goes unchecked. He did not shout, he did not stab, he did not need to. His violence was in the incision, the injection, the quiet record-keeping of lives broken apart. His crimes were not committed in a secret basement, but in bright rooms under clean lights, with assistants standing by. That is what makes him unforgettable. Auschwitz taught the world about the depths of cruelty. Mengele reminded us that even in silence, evil can thrive. It does not always look like a monster. Sometimes it looks like a doctor. By the waning weeks of 1944, the once unthinkable was drawing closer. The Red Army, moving westward through Poland, had already liberated Majdanek. The Soviets pressed toward Kraków, and the name Auschwitz, once uttered only in whispers, began appearing in Allied intelligence briefings. The Germans knew what this meant. The great machine of death they had built was about to be exposed. And so, in the dark weeks that followed, the Nazi regime turned its final chapter at Auschwitz into one of frantic concealment, destruction, and forced exodus, what would become known as the Death Marches. The first signs came quietly. Orders were issued, blueprints and ledgers were burned. The SS began transferring files, dismantling structures, and attempting to hide the machinery of murder. Crematoria Ivor and V, already damaged from prisoner uprisings, were demolished. Crematoria 2 and 3 were blown up in haste, but the vastness of Auschwitz could not be undone in a few weeks. The chimneys still stood. The barbed wire still glinted. The bones, the ash, the fingerprints of genocide were embedded in every corner of the earth. As Soviet artillery rumbled closer, the Nazis focused their attention not only on destruction but on removal of evidence, removal of prisoners. Beginning in mid-January 1945, they issued orders to evacuate tens of thousands of inmates from Auschwitz and its subcamps. The majority of these prisoners, mostly Jews, but also Poles, Roma, and Soviet POWs, were to be marched westward through snow-covered landscapes toward camps in Germany and Austria. It was bitterly cold. The air sliced like knives, the ground frozen solid beneath worn-out clogs. Most prisoners had no winter clothing, just their thin striped uniforms, blankets tied across their shoulders, or scraps of fabric scavenged from the dead. The marches began early in the morning, and they did not stop. SS guards marched prisoners in columns of hundreds, often shooting those who stumbled, fell behind, or asked for water. The rules were simple and merciless: keep moving or die. Entire roads were lined with corpses frozen in place, limbs twisted, mouths open in silent gasps. The snow, once white, was soon tinged with blood and ash. These were not orderly evacuations. They were death marches in every sense. Survivors remembered walking for hours with no food, no rest, no clear destination. Some were marched over 50 kilometers to railway junctions, only to be packed again into open freight cars with no shelter from the elements. Others were marched even farther, toward camps like Gross-Rosen, Bockenwald, Malthausen, and Bergen-Belsen. Many prisoners attempted to help each other, sharing bread, supporting the weak, but their own strength was failing. Starvation had reduced their bodies to fragile shells. Feet split open and bled. Eyes sank, teeth loosened. Some prisoners simply stopped walking, laid down in the snow and waited for the end. For the SS guards, it was a time of fraying discipline. Some followed orders with blind cruelty, shooting with cold precision. Others drank heavily, brutalized prisoners without reason, or lashed out in fear of what lay ahead. And a few, though rare, looked away when prisoners escaped into the forest, unwilling or unable to continue their role in the dying machinery of the Third Reich. Yet, even among the horror, glimmers of resistance remained. In some marches, prisoners managed to flee into nearby villages or forests, where local civilians or partisans offered brief sanctuary. A few were taken in, hidden in barns, fed by strangers, but such acts were rare and dangerous. The penalty for helping a prisoner was death, and many civilians, broken by years of fear and propaganda, turned away. Back at Auschwitz, the camp was nearly empty. Most SS guards had fled. The crematoria lay in rubble. Only a few thousand prisoners remained, those deemed too sick, too weak, or too close to death to be moved. They were left behind, abandoned to their fate. On January 27, 1945, the Soviet 60th Army arrived. The soldiers had no expectation of what they were about to see. What they found was beyond comprehension. The gates of Auschwitz, long symbols of terror, now stood open. Snow drifted quietly across the compound. Silence hung like fog. Inside, emaciated survivors wandered like ghosts. They could barely speak. Some had collapsed in the snow, too weak to move. Others clung to blankets or to each other, waiting to be seen, touched, helped. The Red Army brought with them food, medicine, and disbelief. They liberated over 7,000 prisoners that day, but what they truly uncovered was a wound on the world. The camp was in ruins, but its secrets had not all been destroyed. The Soviets found gas chambers partially intact, crematoria ruins, warehouses filled with human hair, prosthetic limbs, and mountains of shoes. They found ledgers, lists, and piles of ashes. They found children, some still able to walk, others unable to lift their heads, survivors of Mengelé's experiments, marked not just by numbers but by scars. Photographers and journalists arrived shortly after, capturing the images that would soon shock the globe. Skeletal figures in striped rags, chimneys in the background, the faces of children too old for their years. The world would see what the survivors had lived, and yet the full extent of the death marches. The numbers, the pain, the individual stories would take years to emerge. It's estimated that of the 60,000 prisoners evacuated from Auschwitz, more than 15,000 died during the marches. Many more perished in the camps to which they were taken, unable to survive the final winter of the war. The marches were not just an evacuation, they were the regime's last act of control, of punishment, of erasure. Even in its collapse, the Nazi system refused to surrender its cruelty. It dragged its victims with it, step after brutal step across a dying empire. The days following the liberation of Auschwitz were quiet and cold. The camp lay frozen under a layer of snow, and the silence that once came from enforced terror now echoed with absence. The crematoria no longer smoked. The roll calls had ended. The beatings, the barking of dogs, the rhythmic gunfire, all had ceased. And yet the survivors did not cheer. There were no celebrations at the gates, no shouts of joy, only exhaustion, only the heavy, aching weight of survival. The Red Army soldiers moved through the ruins cautiously. They opened the barracks, peered into cellars, and stepped through the skeletal remains of blown-up buildings. They found mounds of corpses still frozen in place, bunkhouses reeking of disease, tiny rooms where children had drawn on walls with coal and bits of chalk. They found surgical tables still stained, vials of chemicals, personal belongings sorted and stored in vast warehouses, glasses, toothbrushes, hairbrushes, pots, dolls. Among the survivors were children, some still clutching the hands of siblings, others alone. They spoke in whispers or not at all. Many were the remnants of Mengelé's experiments, still bearing the tattoos and injections that had marked their suffering. Soviet doctors and nurses did what they could, but supplies were limited, and many were already too far gone. The days that followed liberation were filled with confusion. Survivors had no homes to return to, no families left alive. They did not know what would come next. Many did not even know the war was near its end. Some were relocated to temporary hospitals. Others stayed near the camp, too sick or too afraid to move. A few tried to walk away on their own, heading east, west, anywhere that wasn't Auschwitz. But the roads were dangerous. Mines had been laid. German troops still roamed nearby, and so, even in freedom, death lingered. Disease spread rapidly through the weakened bodies of the survivors. Typhus, dysentery, pneumonia. The Soviet army brought medicine, but it arrived too late, for some makeshift burial pits were dug. Names were carved into wooden planks or scratched into stones. Many were buried anonymously, their final moments undocumented, their suffering remembered only in the memories of those who lived on. In the weeks that followed, news of Auschwitz spread through Europe and beyond. Western newspapers carried photographs of the emaciated survivors. Film reels were shown to stunned audiences, scenes of hollow-eyed children, piles of bones, the iconic gates standing open to reveal the horror within. The world could no longer look away. The name Auschwitz entered the language of humanity as a symbol not just of death, but of what happens when hatred is given structure and bureaucracy, uniforms and records, walls and fire. Back in Germany, as the Reich collapsed, the camps to which the Death March survivors had been sent, places like Bergen-Belsen, Dachau, and Mauthausen, were themselves nearing the breaking point. Bergen-Belsen, in particular, became infamous for its appalling conditions. Tens of thousands died there in the final months of the war, many of them evacuees from Auschwitz. By the time British troops liberated Belsen in April 1945, they found a scene even more chaotic than Auschwitz. Thousands of unburied corpses, typhus raging, survivors too weak to stand. For the SS guards who had overseen the evacuations and remained in the camps, accountability came slowly. Some were captured by Soviet or Allied forces. Many fled, changed their names, or blended into civilian populations. Trials would follow in Nuremberg and elsewhere, but justice often felt incomplete. Among the survivors of the marches, memories were fragmented and haunting. They remembered the way the snow fell on the dead, how the wind bit through cloth, how some guards laughed as they shot prisoners who could walk no farther. They remembered the faces of those who simply sat down and never got up again. For years, even decades, many could not speak of these days. There were no words that could hold what had been felt. Yet slowly, stories emerged. Survivors gave testimony. They wrote books, gave interviews, created memorials. They shared the names of those who did not return. They sketched maps of the routes they had walked through, forests, villages, icy roads. They remembered which friend gave them a last crust of bread, which stranger reached out a hand, which child whispered a song through cracked lips. For those who survived both Auschwitz and the death marches, the act of living itself became a statement of defiance. Every step forward, every child born afterward, every sentence spoken aloud in their own name, not a number, was a rebuke to the regime that had tried to erase them. In later years, monuments were erected along the death march routes, simple plaques, stone columns, inscriptions in multiple languages. They mark places where bodies were buried or where prisoners paused. These places, once unknown fields or silent roads, became sacred ground. Each footprint in the snow had become part of history. Today, when visitors walk through Auschwitz, past the shattered crematoria and the reconstructed barracks, they often struggle to imagine what came after, how anyone could go on, how one could carry so much pain, so much memory. But those who walked from Auschwitz in the final days of the war, barefoot, starving, clutching life like a fragile ember, did not only walk into freedom, they carried forward a truth that even in the final desperate hours of the Nazi regime, when the gas chambers burned their last fires and the rifles made their last echoes, cruelty did not vanish quietly. It marched, it fled, it left scars across the land, and still, it did not silence the voices of those who bore witness. The death marches were not the end. They were a final wound inflicted by a regime that could not face its own failure except through more violence. But even that final wound did not erase what endured: names, stories, light in the darkest places. Among the most haunting presences to emerge from the smoke and silence of Auschwitz were the children, small, hollow-eyed, and bewildered. Their very existence within the camp seemed to defy logic. How, in a place designed for extermination, did any child survive? Most did not. The overwhelming majority were killed on arrival, swept into the line that led straight to the gas chambers, deemed unfit for labor, unnecessary, a burden. Yet a small number slipped through, shielded by circumstance, selected for experiments, used for propaganda, or hidden away in the margins of the machinery of death. Their stories are rare and fragile, like cracked photographs salvaged from the ruins. But they speak, even now, in quiet tones of loss, courage, and the last traces of innocence in a world bent on its destruction. When transports arrived at Auschwitz, selection was immediate and brutal. SS doctors stood on the platform, often including Josef Mengele, making split-second decisions. Those deemed capable of work were sent into the camp. The rest, including nearly all children under the age of 12, were sent to their deaths. Mothers with children in their arms were usually directed to the gas chambers, the act of holding a baby interpreted as proof of unfitness for labor. Some women, understanding the stakes, tried to convince their children to walk independently. Others, in a last act of defiance or love, refused to be separated. They walked together into the darkness. And yet, in rare exceptions, children were admitted into the camp. Some lied about their age. A boy of 14 might say he was 17. A girl of 12 might be passed through if she appeared tall, strong, or useful for labor. Others were brought in as part of family camps, like the Theresienstadt transport, which kept families together for propaganda purposes. Still others, especially twins, were selected by Mengele for experimentation. Those who survived the initial selection faced a different kind of death: starvation, disease, fear, in a place devoid of joy, where every act of kindness came with risk. These children lived on the edge of silence. They were surrounded by suffering they could not understand. Many had seen their parents killed or taken away. Others wandered alone, too young to grasp what Auschwitz truly was. In the children's barracks there was no schooling, no play in any ordinary sense. The walls were bare, the beds overcrowded, blankets, if there were any, were thin and lice-ridden. Some children slept 3 or 4 to a plank, clutching each other for warmth. They shared whispered stories, invented games with pebbles and string, and hummed lullabies remembered from home. Older children, those able to work, were often assigned light labor, carrying messages, cleaning latrines, sorting rags. A few worked in the Canada warehouses, sorting through the belongings of the murdered. These children handled shoes, photographs, toys, wedding rings, objects that once belonged to people just like their parents or themselves. It was confusing, it was traumatizing, but it also meant they had a slightly better chance at food or stolen goods. Those used for experiments were treated differently. Mengele's twin children were housed in separate blocks, given slightly better food, and monitored constantly. They underwent daily examinations, measurements, blood tests, X-rays, and surgeries without anesthesia. Many died. Those who survived were often left sterile, scarred, and haunted. Some had no memory of the experiments themselves, only the cold hands, the bright lights, the pain. For girls, life in the camp carried added terror. Adolescent girls were sometimes preyed upon by guards or capos. Others were forcibly sterilized in brutal medical procedures. Some tried to disguise themselves as boys to avoid attention. There were no safe spaces, no trusted adults, only fleeting friendships. The comfort of being near someone else who was also afraid. Yet even in these bleak surroundings, children sometimes formed bonds of affection, creating makeshift families among themselves. An older girl might look after younger ones, sharing her bread, helping them hide during selections. Boys formed small gangs for protection, trading favors or scraps of food. These tiny gestures, so normal in any other setting, became lifelines in a world where care was rare. The SS rarely showed mercy, but some prisoner functionaries, Jewish doctors, nurses, or secretaries, tried to shield children when they could. They smuggled in extra rations, they lied about ages, they hid the sick from selections. These quiet acts of resistance often came at great risk, yet they became one of the only lines of defense for the camp's smallest inmates. There were moments of tenderness too, whispers of the world that had once been, a boy reciting a prayer his father had taught him, a girl tracing the outline of her mother's face in her mind each night, children who played pretend, imagining themselves back in school, back in their own beds, surrounded by warmth. They told each other stories, they remembered birthdays, they tried to keep their names alive. When liberation came, the children who remained were among the weakest. Many could not walk. Some could not speak. Soviet soldiers lifted them from their bunks, wrapped them in blankets, and carried them out into the sunlight. Doctors tried to nurse them back to health. Some responded, Others, their bodies too far gone, died in the days and weeks that followed. Those who lived grew into adults with memories most could never understand. Some were adopted, others passed through orphanages, displaced persons camps, immigration interviews. They carried with them numbers tattooed on arms, too small to have borne such marks. They carried the faces of mothers and fathers lost in the smoke. They also carried questions. Why had they survived when so many others had not? What had happened to the sibling they last saw on the ramp? Where was home? Could home even exist again? For decades, many stayed silent. The memories too sharp, the language too inadequate. Only later, often in old age, did they begin to speak. For many child survivors, their liberation from Auschwitz was only the beginning of a different kind of struggle. A quiet, lifelong process of relearning how to live, how to speak, how to trust. Their childhoods had not been interrupted but erased, replaced with routines of hunger, pain, and fear. And now, with the war ending and the world resuming its rhythm, they had to navigate life with memories too large for their years, burdens no child should ever bear. Some were taken to hospitals set up by the Red Army or international relief organizations. These field hospitals, often under-equipped and overcrowded, did what they could. Doctors tried to reverse the effects of malnutrition and disease. Psychologists and social workers, many themselves displaced, attempted to reach into the emotional silence of these children. But the scars ran deep. Some children flinched at loud noises. Others refused to speak. Many wept uncontrollably at night, calling out for mothers who would never answer. In time, these children were moved to orphanages or special homes where they lived alongside other survivors. Jewish, Polish, Roma, and others, each with their own trauma. Some were lucky enough to be reunited with distant relatives. Others were adopted by families abroad. Their identities changed, their pasts blurred or hidden in an effort to help them start fresh. But fresh starts were hard. A child who had witnessed mass murder, who had held a sibling's hand on the selection ramp, who had seen fire rise from chimneys day after day, such a child carried a darkness few could understand. Some adjusted well, learning new languages, excelling in school, even smiling again. Others withdrew into silence, struggling with nightmares, flashbacks, or deep anxiety. For many, the fear of abandonment never left. There were children who had been babies in Auschwitz, too young to remember, but marked just the same. Some grew up with no memory of the camp, but bore its legacy in their health, weakened immune systems, developmental delays, or mysterious chronic illnesses. Others learnt their stories only in adulthood, through faded photographs, whispers from surviving relatives, or tattooed numbers that had no other explanation. Over the years, many of these children, now adults, chose to share their stories. They wrote memoirs, they spoke at schools, universities, and memorial events. They returned to Auschwitz as elderly visitors, walking slowly past the ruins where they had once huddled in fear, and they met each other, fellow survivors, children of the camp, who remembered the same smells, the same routines, the same losses. In these encounters, some found a kind of healing. One woman remembered the way a fellow child survivor would brush her hair in the barracks to soothe her. Decades later, they found each other again, living in different countries but still connected by those fragile threads of memory. Another recalled a song her bunkmate would hum each night, a melody she later taught her grandchildren. These small moments, once buried in pain, became bridges to the present. Some survivors carried physical reminders, a faded tattoo, a scar from a medical procedure, a limp from an untreated illness. Others bore emotional ones, the tendency to hoard food, to panic in crowds, to distrust authority. and yet they also carried resilience. They had endured one of the darkest places in human history, and emerged with stories not only of terror, but of the human spirit's capacity to endure. In memorials around the world, children are often the focus: statues of barefoot figures, plaques with names, glass cases filled with tiny shoes. Visitors pause longest here, imagining what could have been, lives unlived, songs unsung. And among the survivors who speak today, the stories of the children of Auschwitz remain among the most powerful, not because they are more tragic than others, but because they pierce directly into the heart. For a child to survive Auschwitz meant more than avoiding death. It meant learning to grow again, to trust again, to hope again. It meant building a life from ashes, a future from silence, and for many, it meant telling the world over and over what had been done to them, not to hold on to the pain, but to make sure it would never be repeated. Each of these stories is different. Some speak in soft, trembling voices, others with fiery determination, but all carry the same message, that even in the darkest place imaginable, there were children. Children who suffered, children who survived, and children who remembered. Auschwitz tried to erase them, tried to turn them into numbers, into shadows, but they endured. Their voices still echo, not just in history books or memorial halls, but in classrooms, in families, in art, in law. They became the living testimony of what was done and what must never be allowed again. They were not supposed to live, but they did. And that, too, is part of Auschwitz's story. In the heart of Auschwitz, where death loomed over every breath and the earth itself seemed soaked with silence and sorrow, resistance lived. It lived quietly, secretly, often invisibly, but it lived in the whispered plans beneath bunks, in smuggled notes passed between trembling hands, in the will to remember a name when all the world tried to reduce life to a number. In a place designed to extinguish hope, even the smallest act of defiance carried the weight of rebellion. To resist in Auschwitz was not like resistance in the outside world. There were no armies, no weapons, no open revolts where prisoners could storm the gates. Here resistance took many forms, each one dangerous, each one quietly heroic. It could be a stolen crumb of bread, shared with a starving child. It could be a song sung softly in the dark. It could be a drawing scratched into the wooden wall of a barrack, or the memory of a prayer said silently when all rituals had been banned. From the earliest days of the camp, networks began to form, silent alliances between prisoners of different backgrounds, languages, and faiths. Political prisoners, especially Polish resistors and communists, were among the first to organize. Some had military experience, others had connections to underground networks beyond the fences. They created secret channels of communication, coded messages, and even plans to sabotage camp operations. One of the most remarkable examples of this underground network was the Auschwitz resistance movement, composed of several interlinked groups operating across various sections of the camp. Among them were Jews, Poles, Russians, and other nationalities. Despite speaking different languages and often suffering different fates, they shared a single goal: to fight back however they could. Smuggling became a key form of resistance. Prisoners who worked in the Canada warehouses, sorting the belongings of those sent to the gas chambers, often found medicines, food, or clothing hidden among the suitcases. These items were smuggled out and distributed among the sick. Some prisoners risked their lives to smuggle out reports, tiny scraps of paper describing the gas chambers, the crematoria, the selections. These reports were sent to the Polish resistance, and eventually to the Allies. Doctors and nurses imprisoned in the camp played a unique role. They worked in unsanitary, overcrowded hospital blocks, often with no supplies, yet many resisted quietly, falsifying death certificates, hiding patients from selections, or administering diluted poisons to ease unbearable suffering. Some secretly documented the diseases and injuries they saw, creating hidden medical records that would later be used in war crime trials. Even acts of remembering became resistance. In a place where names were replaced with numbers and identities were stripped away. Some prisoners kept secret journals, writing on scraps of cloth, toilet paper, or smuggled notebooks. They recorded the names of those who died, the dates, the faces. They knew the camp wanted them forgotten, so they remembered. In 1944, the resistance took one of its boldest steps, the Sonderkommando uprising. The Sonderkommando were special units of mostly Jewish prisoners, forced to work in the crematoria, guiding victims to the gas chambers, removing corpses, burning bodies. These men lived under constant surveillance and were regularly executed to keep the secrets of the killing process hidden. Yet, even under such conditions, they planned a revolt, using gunpowder smuggled from the munitions factory by young women like Rosa Rabota, Estusia Weijblum, and Regina Safed-Tyen. They fashioned crude explosives. On October 7, 1944, Sonderkommando workers at Crematorium 4 attacked the guards with hammers, stones, and makeshift weapons. They set fire to the building, destroying part of the gas chamber facility. Simultaneously, other prisoners in different parts of the camp attempted to rise up, though not all succeeded. The revolt was quickly crushed. Hundreds were killed on the spot. The women who had smuggled the gunpowder were tortured and hanged. Yet, the impact of their actions was immense. They had shown that even within the deepest machinery of genocide, resistance was possible. They had burned part of Auschwitz, and they had refused to go quietly. Women, too, played a vital role in resistance. In the women's camp, underground educators secretly taught children how to read and write. Prisoners shared information, passed messages, and maintained friendships across linguistic and national lines. Even the simple act of grooming, combing hair, mending a garment, sharing a story, became a form of spiritual resistance, an assertion of dignity. There were escapes, though they were rare. Some prisoners, through careful planning and extraordinary luck, managed to flee the camp. One of the most famous escapees was Witold Pilecki, a Polish resistance fighter who volunteered to be arrested and sent to Auschwitz in 1940. Once inside, he built one of the first underground networks and sent detailed reports to the outside world. After nearly 3 years, he escaped, surviving to tell the world about what was happening inside the camp. His reports reached the Polish underground and eventually the Allies. Though his pleas were not immediately acted upon, his documents remain among the most detailed early eyewitness accounts of Auschwitz. The story of Witold Pilecki, one of Auschwitz's most extraordinary witnesses, is a profound testament to bravery. He was not caught. He volunteered, intentionally allowing himself to be captured by the Nazis in 1940, so he could enter Auschwitz and document the horrors within. Inside the camp, he organized intelligence cells, gathered data on SS operations, and coordinated with other prisoners to collect evidence of the mass killings taking place. His reports, sent via smuggled messages and escapees, reached the Polish government in exile and the Western Allies, laying bare the scale of the atrocities. And still, for many months, the world doubted the full truth of his testimony. The crimes he described seemed unimaginable, yet they were all too real. Pilecki eventually escaped in 1943, risking everything to deliver his evidence in person. His story is one of immense courage, but it is also a reminder that many warnings were sounded long before the liberation, and far too few listened. Within Auschwitz, his name became part of a quiet legend whispered among prisoners who found courage in the knowledge that someone among them was still fighting for the world to know. Other escapes, though less famous, were no less courageous. In April 1944, two Slovak Jews, Rudolf Vrba and Alfred Wetzler, managed a daring escape, hiding in a prepared cavity in a woodpile for several days before slipping past the guards. They eventually reached Slovakia. There they dictated a report detailing the extermination process at Auschwitz, including the design of the gas chambers, train arrivals and selections. Their document, now known as the Vrba-Wetzler Report, was among the most crucial pieces of evidence in revealing the systematic murder occurring behind Auschwitz's barbed wire. This report was passed to the Allies and eventually led to widespread media coverage. It forced the world to reckon with Auschwitz not as a rumor or a battlefield tragedy, but as a deliberate machine of mass death. And though the war continued, the escapees' efforts contributed to diplomatic pressure on Hungary to halt the deportation of Jews, an effort that saved thousands of lives in its final months. Yet resistance was not only measured by grand acts. There were moments of quiet defiance that sustained spirits. A poem recited beneath a blanket, a secret Sabbath prayer whispered under breath, a drawing scratched into a hidden plank. Even humor, dark and desperate, served as resistance. Some prisoners created satirical sketches mocking their captors. Others sang parodies of German marching songs. In a world of forced conformity, even laughter could be a rebellion. Language became a weapon of survival and resistance. Prisoners learned the signals, the commands, the dialects of the guards to anticipate danger. Multilingual prisoners served as interpreters and messengers, connecting inmates from different countries. They traded information, passed warnings, and maintained fragile lines of communication within the vast camp complex. There were also spiritual resistances. Religious observances carried out in secret, often with makeshift items, became affirmations of identity and faith. A crust of bread substituted for matzah on Passover, a hidden candle lit for a murdered loved one, a whispered Ave Maria, or a silent Muslim prayer in the dark. These small rituals anchored people to a sense of self beyond their numbered identities. The will to survive itself was a form of resistance. To wake each day, to carry on with work, to protect a friend, to refuse despair, these were acts of will that challenged the camp's intent to reduce every person to an object. The Nazis had designed Auschwitz to break both body and spirit, but in countless ways, prisoners found ways to remain human, to care, to believe. Outside the camp, resistance took other forms. The Polish Home Army launched sabotage operations against railway lines and infrastructure supporting the deportation trains. Allied intelligence agencies received reports, albeit fragmentary, from occupied Europe, and partisans in forests across Poland and Ukraine struck German convoys, rescued fugitives, and occasionally helped escaped prisoners. Some guards, too, became unwilling participants in this resistance. A few turned a blind eye to small infractions, one or two even smuggled messages or medicines. These were rare exceptions, but their actions, often shrouded in mystery, played a role in the survival of certain prisoners. Most guards remained complicit, but a few cracks appeared in the wall of brutality. And then there were those who resisted, not with fists or fire, but with truth. After the war, many survivors gave testimony. They returned to the places of their torment to speak, to teach, to remember aloud what others had tried to forget. Their words became a final resistance against silence. Every hidden diary, every painted sketch found buried in the ground, Every name remembered was a thread in the tapestry of defiance. Auschwitz tried to make people disappear, but these acts, these memories, these legacies kept them alive. Resistance in Auschwitz was never simple. It was not always successful. It was often fatal, but it existed in shadows, in whispers, in moments where people said no even when yes was safer. And in those quiet moments of defiance, the humanity that Auschwitz sought to erase continued to burn softly but stubbornly through the cold. The liberation of Auschwitz came not with fanfare or flags, but with footsteps muffled by snow. On January 27th, 1945, soldiers of the Soviet 60th Army entered the gates. They were met not by resistance, nor by retreating German fire, but by silence, a heavy, haunted silence that hung over the barracks, the guard towers and the ruins of the crematoria. The SS had fled days earlier, taking with them tens of thousands of prisoners on forced marches. What remained were the bones of a machine and the ghosts of those it had devoured. The Red Army had seen war's destruction before, but nothing prepared them for Auschwitz. As they moved deeper into the camp, they encountered the skeletal survivors, 7,000 of them, too sick, too starved, too broken to have been marched away. They found emaciated children lying in wooden bunks, their eyes wide, bodies wrapped in filthy rags. They found men and women with sunken cheeks and trembling limbs, many unable to speak, in the hospital blocks. Bodies lay beside the living. The dead no longer shocked the survivors. They had lived among corpses for too long. The Soviet soldiers did what they could. They gave food, wrapped blankets around shivering frames, and carried people from bunks to warmth. But aid was limited. Supplies were scarce, and disease had already taken root. Typhus and dysentery spread quickly through the camp, and in the weeks after liberation, hundreds more would die. The Soviets set up temporary hospitals in nearby towns and buildings. Doctors worked without rest. Volunteers arrived, but the damage, in many cases, could not be undone. Some survivors were transported to field hospitals for extended care. Others remained in the area for months, too weak to travel, or unwilling to leave the place where their loved ones had perished. They wandered the grounds of Auschwitz like pilgrims in a desecrated temple, searching for faces among the ruins, whispering names, leaving flowers by the rubble. They were free, and yet they did not feel free. Liberation did not erase the pain, it simply opened the door to its remembrance. As word of the camp's liberation spread, the world began to reckon with what had been uncovered. Journalists and photographers arrived soon after. They documented everything. The piles of shoes, the warehouses of hair, the ovens, the personal belongings left behind in Canada, the haunting emptiness of the gas chambers. Images were published in newspapers across Europe and the United States. For many, this was the first visual proof of the Holocaust's scale. Allied governments, which had received scattered reports of the atrocities for years, were now confronted with undeniable evidence. And with this evidence came questions of accountability, of justice, of how such crimes could have been committed and concealed. The reckoning began. In the months that followed, the Soviet authorities gathered materials for investigation. Testimonies were taken, documents were collected, film crews captured the evidence on celluloid, gas chambers, barracks, survivors. The Soviet Union was the first to officially preserve Auschwitz as a historical site. In July 1947, the Polish government created the Auschwitz-Birkenau State Museum. Parts of the camp were left as they were. Others were reconstructed to educate visitors. But even as Auschwitz was transformed into a site of memory, justice was taking shape elsewhere. The Nuremberg trials began in late 1945, bringing high-ranking Nazi officials to account. The charge of crimes against humanity was coined in part to address what had been discovered in the camps. Eyewitness testimony, photographs, and documents from Auschwitz were presented as evidence. The tribunal became the first global attempt to define and prosecute genocide. Still, not all perpetrators were punished. Many SS officers from Auschwitz had fled or hidden. Some were captured by Allied forces. Others escaped through rat lines, networks that helped Nazi fugitives flee to South America and the Middle East. It would take decades for some to be found. Joseph Mengele, Auschwitz's angel of death, eluded justice until his death in Brazil in 1979. Other trials followed in Poland, in West Germany, in Israel. Witnesses testified. Survivors recounted their experiences in courtrooms across Europe. Some trials lasted years, others ended in lenient sentences or acquittals. Justice, though powerful, was not always complete. The scale of the Holocaust dwarfed the machinery built to respond to it. In the years after the war, survivors faced another kind of reckoning, the challenge of rebuilding life. They scattered across the globe to the United States, Canada, Israel, Australia, and elsewhere. Some found family members, others started new families. Many chose not to speak about their past for decades. The wounds were too fresh, the memories too sharp. For those who had survived Auschwitz, the liberation marked not a neat conclusion, but the beginning of an uncertain and often lonely chapter. In displaced persons camps scattered across Europe, survivors tried to recover their identities, reclaim fragments of family, and find somewhere in the world that would accept them. Many were stateless. Many had no remaining relatives. Others discovered that even if their town still stood, the neighbors they once knew were gone, or worse, had played a role in their deportation. The trauma followed them. Some woke each night in panic, still hearing the dogs, the sirens, the boots on gravel. Others held on to habits learned in the camps, hoarding food, hiding money, avoiding crowds. The tattooed numbers on their arms often sparked questions or suspicion. In some places, survivors were met not with sympathy, but with silence or even resentment. In post-war Poland, anti-Jewish violence flared again. In other parts of Europe, the guilt of bystanders made their welcome fragile and strained. But over time, the world began to understand. Survivors wrote memoirs. They spoke in public. They built new lives, careers, families. Some became teachers, writers, rabbis, artists. They founded Holocaust education centers. They returned to Auschwitz, not always physically, but in words, in film, in memory. They made the camp live on, not as a place of death, but as a warning, and the world listened, slowly, sometimes haltingly, but it listened. In the decades following the war, Auschwitz became not just a site of memory, but a symbol, a name that encapsulated the unspeakable. Museums rose across continents. Memorials were built. Educational programs took root in schools. The survivors once voiceless became guides to history. The reckoning continued in law too. In the 1960s, the Frankfurt Auschwitz trials marked a new phase of accountability. Unlike Nuremberg, these trials focused on lower-level officials, guards, doctors, clerks, those who had not crafted policy but had enforced it. The world was forced to confront the ordinariness of evil. The defendants looked like shopkeepers, teachers, postal workers. Many had claimed they were simply following orders. Testimony from survivors overwhelmed the courtroom. Their words were often the only evidence of specific crimes. For some, it was the first time they had been heard. For others, it was a painful reopening of wounds. But these trials helped cement a truth that would echo through generations, that no one who participated in Auschwitz's machinery could claim innocence through obedience alone. In Israel, the 1961 trial of Adolf Eichmann, one of the architects of the final solution, brought Auschwitz back into public consciousness. For weeks, survivors testified on live radio and television, telling the world about the selections, the gas chambers, the labor, the loss. Their testimonies shaped how later generations would understand the Holocaust, not just as a political event, but as a human catastrophe. The reckoning extended into culture. Books like Night by Elie Wiesel and If This Is a Man by Primo Levi brought Auschwitz into literature. Films like Shoah, Schindler's List, and The Pianist brought it to the screen. Each story added layers of memory. Each voice deepened the silence with meaning. Auschwitz itself became a site of pilgrimage. Survivors returned with their children and grandchildren. Leaders from around the world walked through its gates. Pope John Paul II visited, so did Elie Wiesel, and later presidents and prime ministers. They stood on the railway platform. They laid wreaths at the wall of death. They bowed their heads beneath the sky where ashes once fell. The museum preserved the site with care and reverence. Barracks were stabilized. Artifacts were displayed with restraint. Personal belongings, shoes, glasses, suitcases were arranged not to shock but to testify. Guides spoke in hushed tones. Visitors wept. For many, it was not just a history lesson, but a spiritual confrontation. The reckoning reached future generations too. Laws were passed in Germany and across Europe against Holocaust denial. Holocaust Remembrance Day, January 27th, the date Auschwitz was liberated, was adopted by the United Nations and marked in dozens of countries. Survivors spoke in schools. Their stories were recorded in archives, libraries, and oral history projects. As they aged, their urgency grew. Tell the story before it is lost. And yet, the reckoning is not finished. Across the world, memory competes with denial, with distortion, with apathy. Some rewrite history, some diminish it, some forget. The lessons of Auschwitz must be retaught with every generation. Its meaning must be re-inherited, not assumed. For Auschwitz was not a storm. It was not a natural disaster. It was a choice made by individuals, enabled by institutions, carried out by ordinary people in uniform. And because it was a choice, it can happen again. That is why remembering matters. That is why the reckoning must never end. Liberation freed bodies. But the memory, the warning, the burden, those remain, in the names whispered on memorial walls, in the voices preserved in audio reels and paper journals, in the cold wind that still moves through the gate, that says, Arbeit macht frei, freedom came late, but memory came to stay. When the gates of Auschwitz finally stood open, and the last echoes of boots and barked orders faded into the wind, the prisoners who remained did not erupt into celebration. There were no shouts of triumph, no joyful embraces. Liberation came not as a moment of euphoria, but as a strange, uncertain quiet, a kind of dazed release from the grip of death into a world that had forgotten how to feel like life. The survivors stepped out not as victors, but as shadows of who they had once been, their bodies frail, their eyes hollow, their spirits suspended somewhere between existence and memory. And for each of them, the question loomed, what now? The end of the camp's machinery did not mean the end of suffering. It meant the beginning of a different kind of endurance. In those first days after liberation, survivors lay on bunks too weak to rise, unsure whether the hunger in their bellies would ever be stilled, or whether the silence in their hearts would ever be filled again. Many died in those early days of typhus, of exposure, of injuries too long untreated. Soviet doctors and nurses did what they could. They brought food, medicine, warmth, but it was not enough for all. For those who survived the immediate aftermath, the journey ahead was staggering. Where could they go? Who was left? Many had no family to return to, no homes that still stood, no towns that would welcome them. They were Jews, Roma, political prisoners, resistance fighters, Jehovah's Witnesses, and others, labeled, branded, erased. And now, in a Europe still trembling from the war's end, they had to find a way to be human again, in a world that had so recently declared them subhuman. Displaced persons. DP camps became the first fragile stop on that journey. Across Germany, Austria, and Italy, the Allies established temporary settlements for the millions uprooted by the war. For Holocaust survivors, these camps were both a refuge and a reminder. They were still behind barbed wire, still counted, still assigned bunks. But here there were no guards with rifles. There were nurses, teachers, social workers. Slowly, painfully, survivors began to eat regularly, to sleep without fear, to speak their names again. But healing was uneven. The psychological wounds ran deep. Some survivors found themselves unable to sleep in beds, preferring the cold floor where they had once laid in the barracks. Others hoarded bread under their pillows, unable to believe that tomorrow's meal would still come. Nightmares were common, reliving the selections, the gas chambers, the death marches. Some found themselves mute. Others spoke non-stop, afraid of silence. Many were reunited with others who had survived, cousins, siblings, childhood friends. The joy of reunion was often shadowed by guilt. Why had they lived when so many had not? What had they done to survive? And how could they carry the memories of those who had perished? The mother who had shielded them on the ramp, the child they had shared soup with in Block 10, the father whose hand they had let go of at the crematorium gate. Some survivors began writing letters, diaries, early testimonies. Words became a kind of scaffolding, a way to build structure from chaos. Others stayed silent for years, burying their pain beneath new names, new lives, new continents. Each survivor's path was different, but all carried a weight that would never fully lift. Children posed a special challenge. Thousands had survived the camps, or the war years hidden in attics, convents, or forests. Many no longer remembered their names, their families, or even their native language. They were taken into care by relief organizations like the Joint Distribution Committee, the Red Cross, and Jewish refugee agencies. In time, some were adopted by families abroad in Britain, Canada, America, or Palestine. Others grew up in orphanages in Eastern Europe, or in newly created children's homes in France, Belgium, and Switzerland. Some of these children never learned their true origins. Others spent their lives searching for traces of parents they barely remembered, a photograph, a record, a grave, and some found that the truth, when uncovered, was too painful to bear. For many adult survivors, the post-war world was both a place of promise and profound dislocation. As borders shifted and governments fell, refugees waited, sometimes for years, for visas, sponsors, or permission to immigrate. The United States, Britain, Canada, and Australia opened their doors slowly and selectively. Palestine, then under British mandate, became the destination of hope for many Jewish survivors. Though immigration quotas, blockades, and British policies often made the journey perilous, those who reached Palestine, and later the new state of Israel, found themselves in yet another struggle, this time for national survival. Some joined the ranks of fighters in the 1948 War of Independence. Others settled in kibbutzim or cities and began again. There the identity of survivor often carried a complicated weight. In the early years of the Israeli state, some Israelis looked upon Holocaust survivors with discomfort, viewing them as symbols of victimhood, even passivity. But over time, Their stories became central to Israeli memory and nationhood. In the United States and other Western countries, survivors faced a different kind of rebuilding. Many arrived with nothing but the clothes on their backs and the numbers tattooed on their arms. Yet they began families. They opened bakeries, tailor shops, bookstores. They sent their children to schools and universities. They moved into neighborhoods and lived lives of quiet normalcy, at least on the surface. Often it was their children who bore the first echoes of their unspoken traumas. Known as the second generation, many grew up with parents who avoided discussing the war, but carried its shadows everywhere, in their rituals, their silences, their overprotectiveness, their emotional distance. Some children of survivors reported feeling a profound sense of inherited grief, a responsibility to remember a story they were never told. As the decades passed, the question of how to remember Auschwitz became both personal and collective. Survivors aged, their numbers dwindled. Many chose to begin speaking publicly only late in life, sensing the urgency of memory as time slipped away. Holocaust education expanded in schools and universities. Documentary films, oral history archives, and survivor memoirs multiplied. In 1978, the miniseries Holocaust aired on American television, bringing the story into millions of homes. In 1985, Claude Lanzmann's film Show offered a stark, nearly 10-hour interview-based portrait of survivors, witnesses, and perpetrators. And in 1993, the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum opened in Washington, D.C., affirming the event's central place in world memory. But with remembrance came new challenges. Denial rose in fringe movements. Some questioned survivor testimonies. Others argued the Holocaust had been exaggerated or politicized. These distortions, though discredited by history, fueled a growing urgency. The truth of Auschwitz must be told again and again, not only for those who lived it, but for those who never would. Survivors took up this charge. They stood before classrooms, courtrooms, and conferences. They returned to Auschwitz with cameras, family members, or world leaders in tow. Their presence gave the ruins voice. The creaking of a wooden barrack floor beneath their steps became an echo of those who had marched there before. Each survivor told a different story. Some spoke of the gas chambers, the crematoria, the selections. Others recalled songs sung in the barracks, prayers whispered in fear, friendships formed under the shadow of the chimneys. Some shared drawings made in secret or letters that survived where people did not. Each testimony added to a fragile mosaic of remembrance. And yet, even as these stories multiplied, a question lingered in many survivors' minds. Had they truly survived? Physically, yes, but spiritually, emotionally. Their lives had continued, but their pasts had not ended. They had merely been folded into the silence of night, the stillness between breaths, the shadows that flickered behind laughter. Some found peace in rebuilding, in gardens, in music, in grandchildren's laughter. Others lived with an ache that no time could ease. But all carried something forward, an ember of memory, of resistance, of love, stronger than hatred. The aftermath of Auschwitz cannot be measured in dates or policies alone. It lives in the trembling hand, reaching for a child's photo in a shoebox, in the poem scribbled in the margin of a prayer book, in the faded photograph pinned to a nursing home wall, in the Hebrew words spoken with trembling pride at a bar mitzvah that would never have been possible in that camp. And above all, it lives in the survivors, the men and women who walked through the valley of death and came out holding stories. They did not owe the world anything, yet they gave us everything. When the war ended and the smoke cleared from Auschwitz's crematoria, the world was left not only with the ashes of the dead, but with questions that hung like a heavy fog over Europe. Who had done this? Who had ordered it? Who had known and allowed it to continue? And above all, how could justice possibly be rendered for a crime so vast, so meticulously organized, and so intimately cruel? The road to reckoning would begin slowly, hesitantly, but would grow into one of the most ambitious and morally charged legal undertakings in human history. The trials that followed the Holocaust and the testimonies of those who survived. The first and most famous of these trials was the International Military Tribunal held in Nuremberg, beginning in November 1945. 24 of the Nazi regime's highest-ranking officials stood before an international court charged with crimes against peace, war crimes, and, most unprecedented of all, crimes against humanity. Among them were Hermann Göring, Rudolf Hess, and Joachim von Ribbentrop. The evidence was overwhelming: films, documents, orders, photographs, and crucially, the voices of survivors. Auschwitz appeared again and again. Its gas chambers, its transports, its systematic killings invoked as the darkest embodiment of Nazi cruelty. One of the most striking aspects of the Nuremberg trials was the way the Nazis' own records were used against them. The Nazis had meticulously documented their crimes. The trains that arrived daily at Auschwitz, the quantities of Zyklon B shipped, the rosters of those assigned to forced labor or extermination. These documents, meant to ensure precision and control, now testified in court as silent witnesses to horror. Survivor testimonies added human texture to the bureaucratic numbers. They described selections, starvation, medical experiments, the slow death of hope. Some survivors testified in person, others submitted written accounts. Their words were unflinching, often trembling but necessary. They told the world in precise and painful detail what had happened behind the electrified fences of Auschwitz, and the world listened. For many outside Europe, this was the first time they had heard directly from victims what had transpired in the camps. The trials were widely covered in the press. Courtroom sketches and grainy photographs captured the faces of both perpetrators and witnesses. The world watched as the defendants, once powerful men in crisp uniforms, now sat in the dock, shrunken, defensive, exposed. Sentences varied. 12 of the Nuremberg defendants were sentenced to death, others to long prison terms. A few were acquitted. But Nuremberg was only the beginning. It established the principle that individuals, not just states, could be held accountable for mass atrocities, and that just following orders was no defense for genocide. Yet, many of the architects of Auschwitz had already escaped. Some had fled Europe. Others were captured later. Joseph Mengele, the camp's most infamous doctor, evaded justice entirely, living in South America under false identities. Rudolf Höss, the commandant of Auschwitz, was captured in 1946 by British soldiers and later handed over to the Polish authorities. He was tried in Warsaw in 1947. During his trial, Höss spoke with chilling calm. He described the construction of the gas chambers, the selection process, the crematoria. He admitted to overseeing the deaths of over 1 million people. His testimony, at once methodical and devoid of remorse, shocked even seasoned investigators. He was found guilty and sentenced to death. In 1947, he was hanged near the former crematorium at Auschwitz, within sight of the killing ground he had once commanded. Other trials followed. In Poland, hundreds of lower-ranking camp staff were prosecuted. Some guards, female overseers, and Kapos prisoners who had collaborated were tried in Krakow, Warsaw, and other cities. In West Germany, initial efforts to prosecute former Nazis were cautious, even reluctant. But by the late 1950s and early 1960s, a new generation of German prosecutors began to revisit the crimes of the Holocaust in earnest. One of the most significant of these efforts was the Frankfurt Auschwitz trials, which began in 1963. Unlike Nuremberg, which focused on Nazi leadership, Frankfurt targeted those who had worked at Auschwitz day by day: doctors, guards, accountants. The courtroom became a stage for remembrance and confrontation. Survivors testified in harrowing detail, often for the first time, about their experiences. They named names. They pointed to photographs. They recounted the smell of burning flesh, the sound of crying children, the terror of selections. The judges listened. So did the public. The trials were widely covered in West Germany and reawakened a society that had, in many corners, tried to forget. And with this public awakening came a shift, a growing awareness that Auschwitz was not simply the work of monsters, but of ordinary people performing extraordinary evil. In the Frankfurt courtroom, the faces of Auschwitz guards were studied not as distant abstractions, but as men who once stood at the gates, who gave orders, who held whips or keys. These were not faceless bureaucrats. They were tangible reminders that the machinery of death had required thousands of human hands, many of them unremarkable, many of them neighbors, shopkeepers, former classmates. The trial sought not only guilt but understanding. How could people who looked so ordinary be part of something so monstrous? Over 200 witnesses were called, many of them Holocaust survivors. For some, it was the first time they had returned to their memories in public. They traveled from Israel, from America, from across Europe to testify. They spoke in voices that trembled but did not break. Their words made Auschwitz real again, not just a place in history books, but a place where a woman had seen her mother disappear in the fog, where a boy had hidden his little brother under straw to shield him from the selection, where death had walked in boots past rows of prisoners, pretending not to cry. The impact of these trials went beyond their verdicts. Though only a fraction of perpetrators were convicted, the testimonies ignited a new wave of memory across Germany and the world. Schools began teaching Holocaust history with renewed seriousness. Memorials appeared in cities that had long preferred to remain silent. A new generation asked questions their parents had never dared to voice. What did you know? Where were you? Why didn't you speak? Justice was uneven. Many perpetrators received mild sentences. Others never faced trial at all. By the time some were tracked down, they were old, frail, or protected by legal ambiguities. In South America, former Nazis like Klaus Barbed and Joseph Mengele lived for decades undisturbed. In Austria, Belgium, and even Canada, alleged war criminals quietly passed as citizens. In some cases, entire communities had knowingly sheltered them. But as time passed, efforts to pursue justice did not fade. They simply changed form. Nazi hunters like Simon Wiesenthal dedicated their lives to tracking fugitives. Wiesenthal, himself a survivor, helped locate over 1,000 Nazi criminals through painstaking investigation. He believed justice was not a matter of vengeance but of truth, that each trial, no matter how delayed, was a moral obligation. In 1961, another landmark trial reignited the world's attention. Adolf Eichmann, one of the chief architects of the final solution, had been captured by Israeli Mossad agents in Argentina and brought to Jerusalem to stand trial. It was the first major war crimes trial broadcast globally. Millions watched as witnesses described Auschwitz and the other camps with unflinching detail. The world listened as Eichmann, bland and bespectacled, claimed he had merely followed orders. Hannah Arendt, a German Jewish philosopher who covered the trial, famously coined the phrase "the banality of evil" to describe what she saw in Eichmann: not a monster, but a bureaucrat, a man who had submitted himself to a murderous system with terrifying efficiency and no apparent hatred. Her words sparked debate, but the trial's impact was clear. The Holocaust was not committed by devils, but by people. That truth disturbed many and motivated others to act. After Eichmann's execution in 1962, trials continued, often led by younger prosecutors, and pursued with increasing urgency as witnesses aged. In the 1980s and 1990s, France, Germany, and the United States reopened investigations. Documents were declassified. Survivors came forward. In Germany, a shift in legal interpretation made it easier to prosecute former guards, not just for specific murders, but for their participation in the overall functioning of the death camps. One of the most symbolic of these late trials came in 2015, when Oskar Groening, the so-called bookkeeper of Auschwitz, was convicted at age 94. He had never killed anyone directly, but he had counted money, sorted belongings, and kept records for those who did. His trial, more than 70 years after the liberation of Auschwitz, marked a turning point. Even small cogs in the machinery of genocide could be held accountable. He died in 2018, awaiting the start of his sentence. And yet no courtroom could contain the full weight of what Auschwitz meant. Legal justice, though essential, could never restore what had been taken. No verdict could return the millions of lost lives, or undo the severed families, or silence the cries that still echoed in the dreams of survivors. Still, the trials mattered. They named the crimes, they recorded the evidence, they shattered denial, and through them, survivors found something precious, not revenge, but validation. Their suffering was no longer a private agony. It was acknowledged, witnessed, preserved. In the end, the testimonies of those who endured Auschwitz became more than evidence. They became sacred stories passed down from one generation to the next. They taught not only about evil, but about resilience, about memory, about the fragile line between civilization and cruelty. And they warned the world, never again must not be a phrase. It must be a promise renewed with every telling, every trial, every name remembered. Long after the final guards had fled and the chimneys no longer smoked, Auschwitz remained, not just in ruins and relics, but in the collective mind of humanity. It was a place transformed from horror to hallowed ground, from a functioning death factory to a vast landscape of memory. And across the years and the generations, the question emerged again and again. How do you remember a place built for forgetting? How do you preserve a site designed to erase? In the wake of its liberation, the architecture of Auschwitz began to evolve, not in bricks and mortar, but in meaning, in symbolism, and in the silent dialogue between memory and history. At first, the remains of Auschwitz were raw and untouched. Barbed wire still stretched across the fields. Wooden barracks sagged under the weight of neglect and time. The crumbling crematoria at Birkenau lay in piles of rubble, destroyed by the retreating SS in an effort to hide the evidence. For a time it was unclear what should become of the site. Should it be left to nature, allowed to dissolve into dust and earth, or should it be preserved, curated, protected, as if to hold time itself in place? The Polish government, working with survivors and international Jewish organizations, chose remembrance. In 1947, just 2 years after liberation, the Auschwitz-Birkenau State Museum was established. It was one of the first Holocaust memorials in the world, and from its inception, it carried a tension that would define memorialization for decades: how to balance education with reverence, how to tell the truth without overwhelming the soul. The preservation effort was monumental. Entire sections of Auschwitz, the original camp, were left intact: brick barracks, iron gates, execution walls. At Birkenau, the massive expanse of ruins, gas chambers, crematoria, wooden barracks and train tracks, remained largely untouched. This site, in its quiet desolation, became the heart of the memory. Visitors walked down the central track where so many trains had arrived. They passed beneath the iconic brick watchtower. They saw the shattered ruins where the gas chambers once stood. And in the silence of that space, history spoke without words. Inside the museum's exhibitions, the personal returned eyeglasses, shoes, suitcases with names, hair still braided, baby clothes folded and faded. These objects, so mundane in life, had become sacred in death. They were not just artifacts, they were echoes. Each item whispered of the life that once animated it. A child's shoe was not just a relic, it was a footprint never followed. A name on a suitcase was not just a label, it was a cry not answered. For survivors who returned, the experience was deeply personal. Some could not bear to walk the grounds again. Others came as witnesses, leading their children and grandchildren through the paths they once marched in chains. Their presence transformed Auschwitz into a living space of testimony. Each survivor who spoke added another thread to the tapestry of remembrance. They described the barracks where they slept, the work they were forced to do, the people they lost. Their words tethered the past to the present. Over time, Auschwitz became a destination not only for survivors and scholars, but for the world. Pilgrimages formed. School groups arrived by the thousands. Political leaders, presidents, popes, and prime ministers passed through the gates. In 1979, Auschwitz was designated a UNESCO World Heritage Site, not for its beauty, but for its significance. It was described as a place of enormous symbolic value, a warning for humanity. With each passing decade, however, the question deepened. How should future generations remember a place they never experienced firsthand? As the last survivors aged, efforts intensified to preserve their voices. Oral history projects collected tens of thousands of testimonies, video archives grew, museums created immersive exhibits, digital technology began to reconstruct the past in virtual spaces. Through all these efforts, the aim was clear: never let memory fade into abstraction. But memory is not static. It is shaped by culture, politics, and time. In different countries, Auschwitz came to symbolize different aspects of loss. For Jews, it was the epicenter of the Holocaust. For Poles, it was also a site of national suffering, where political prisoners and resistance fighters died. For Roma communities, it was a place of near-total annihilation. And for others, it was a symbol of what humans are capable of when hatred is allowed to thrive unchecked. As the decades wore on, the effort to preserve Auschwitz's physical remnants became increasingly urgent. Weather, time, and decay threatened the very structures that bore witness. Wooden barracks warped and splintered, stone crumbled, iron rusted. The museum undertook delicate conservation work, not to restore the site to its original form, but to prevent its disappearance. Preservation without distortion became a guiding principle. To let the camp vanish would be to let history fade. To over-repair it would risk falsifying its story. International partnerships emerged to support this task. In 2009, the Auschwitz-Birkenau Foundation was established to ensure the long-term maintenance of the site. Countries around the world, Germany, the United States, France, Israel, and others, contributed millions. The burden of memory had become a shared responsibility. Auschwitz was no longer just a Polish site or a Jewish site. It belonged to the conscience of the world. And still, even as the bricks were preserved, questions lingered about how Auschwitz should be understood. Could any museum truly convey its horror? Could any exhibition transmit the weight of absence? Curators faced impossible choices. Should the displays be graphic or restrained? Should visitors walk alone or be guided? Should the ruins of the gas chambers be reconstructed to aid understanding or left untouched to honor the dead? These choices reflected broader philosophical debates about how to memorialize atrocity. Some argued that confronting the brutal reality through photographs, documents, and even recreations was necessary to break through apathy. Others believed that too much detail risked voyeurism or re-traumatizing survivors. Auschwitz's curators chose a middle path: dignity, restraint, and silence. The site speaks for itself. The barracks whisper, the stones remember. And so too does the world beyond the fences. Across the globe, Holocaust memorials now echo Auschwitz's legacy. In Berlin, the memorial to the murdered Jews of Europe stretches across a city block, its grey stelae undulating like waves of silence. In Paris, a subterranean crypt honors deported Jews with lists of names carved into stone. In Buenos Aires, Toronto, Johannesburg, Tokyo, every continent bears a monument to memory. Education programs have become another form of architecture, an architecture of the mind. Students study survivor testimonies, read Anne Frank's diary, and watch documentaries like Shoah or Holocaust. Museums like Yad Vashem in Jerusalem and the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington, D.C., immerse visitors in the events of the Holocaust while grounding them in personal stories, in faces and names, in the details that prevent abstraction. And yet, memory is not immune to erosion. In recent years, polls have revealed that younger generations in some countries know less about Auschwitz than their parents did. Conspiracy theories and denial persist online. Political movements have sought to minimize, revise, or co-opt Holocaust memory for other purposes. In such a climate, remembrance becomes an act of resistance. Each time a teacher opens a lesson on Auschwitz, each time a survivor speaks to a group of students, each time a visitor walks past the guard towers in Birkenau, memory is reaffirmed, not as nostalgia, not as guilt, but as duty, as a reminder that Auschwitz was not inevitable. It was the result of decisions, policies, silence, and hate. For the children and grandchildren of survivors, the architecture of memory becomes personal. They carry not only stories but shadows, inherited trauma, unspoken questions, fragmented genealogies. Some feel a responsibility to continue telling. Others quietly observe, unsure how to bear a burden they did not choose. But even in their silence, the thread continues. Artists and writers contribute to this remembrance too. Poets trace their ancestry through verses woven with ash and prayer. Painters render haunted landscapes of wire and snow. Musicians compose elegies. Filmmakers strive to capture truth without spectacle. Memory becomes not only a record of the past but a creative act, a way of rebuilding meaning from what was shattered. Even at Auschwitz itself, new voices are now heard. The museum has embraced digital platforms, allowing virtual visitors from across the world to walk through the gates, to explore exhibits, to hear survivor testimonies. In a world shaped increasingly by screens, the preservation of Auschwitz must adapt to new forms, but always it must keep the core sacred, the reality, the gravity, the humanity behind the numbers. And so the architecture of memory continues to rise, not in marble or steel, but in the hearts of those who remember. In a candle lit on January 27th, in a name read aloud, in a child who asks, "Why did they do this?" in a teacher who answers with patience and truth, Auschwitz no longer functions as it once did. The barbed wire no longer confines. The chimneys no longer smoke, but it lives in testimony, in silence, in warning. It is a place that remembers even when the world forgets. When the flames of Auschwitz were finally extinguished, when the bodies were buried and the world stared into the abyss of its own cruelty, something began to stir in the ashes. It was not vengeance nor swift understanding. It was a slow and uncertain search for meaning. How could such horror be remembered? And more urgently, how could it be taught? From that question grew the foundation of a new kind of education, one rooted not in pride or tradition, but in grief, warning, and the stubborn insistence that memory must serve the future. In the earliest years after the war, Holocaust education was rare, and Auschwitz was spoken of in whispers. Survivors were often reluctant to share their stories. Schools, particularly in post-war Europe, focused on rebuilding national identity, not confronting collective guilt. In Germany, it would take decades for Auschwitz to become a regular subject in the classroom. In Eastern Europe under communist regimes, the Holocaust was folded into narratives of anti-fascist resistance, with its uniquely Jewish dimensions sometimes downplayed or erased. But survivors themselves began planting the seeds through memoirs, lectures, and community meetings. They began to speak softly at first, then with greater urgency. In the 1950s and 60s, landmark books like Elie Wiesel's Night and Primo Levi's If This Is a Man entered the literary world. These were not history textbooks but testimonies. Intimate, personal, searing. They opened a door for readers to feel, not just to know. As time passed, educators, historians, and institutions joined this growing effort. In the United States, the Holocaust was introduced gradually into curricula, often through survivor visits, book readings, or film screenings. In Israel, Holocaust Remembrance Day became a national observance. Sirens sounded, shops closed, ceremonies took place in schools and army bases. Survivors lit memorial flames. Children stood in silence, heads bowed, not in ritual, but in reverence. By the 1980s, Holocaust education had become more formalized. The rise of memorial museums gave it new depth and structure in Jerusalem. Yad Vashem expanded its archives and exhibitions. In Washington, D.C., the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum opened in 1993 with the mission to educate every visitor not only about the past, but about moral choices, human rights, and the consequences of indifference. These institutions became classrooms without blackboards, spaces where people could walk among history. Visitors saw the cattle cars, the bunks, the piles of shoes. They listened to survivor testimony, saw photographs taken by liberators and perpetrators alike. And in those quiet galleries, many began to understand what words alone could not express. Education extended beyond the museums. Teachers began receiving specialized training. Holocaust education centers hosted seminars. Lesson plans were developed, books selected with care. The aim was not just to recite dates or explain policies. It was to humanize, to show faces, to say names, to help students grasp that behind every number was a life with songs and laughter and dreams taken away. In Germany, Holocaust education became a legal requirement in schools. Students were taken to former camps, invited to engage in discussion, even asked to interview survivors. Germany's commitment to remembrance became a model of national self-confrontation, an ongoing process of facing its past with honesty and humility. Yet the task was never easy. Educators faced difficult questions. How much horror can a child bear? When does teaching become trauma? Should graphic images be shown? Should empathy be evoked or critical thinking emphasized? Different approaches emerged, but one principle remained constant. The goal was not to shock but to awaken, not to leave students with nightmares, but with a sense of responsibility. Survivors played a central role for decades. They visited classrooms, told their stories, answered questions. Often their presence left a deeper impression than any textbook. Their words, spoken in living rooms, auditoriums, and classrooms around the world, became the heartbeat of Holocaust education. But time could not be paused. Survivors aged, many passed away. Their testimonies, once living threads to the past, were now preserved in film, text, and sound. Organizations like the Shoda Foundation collected thousands of oral histories. Virtual reality projects began to recreate their voices in interactive form. The challenge now was clear: how to teach the Holocaust without the living witnesses. As the last survivors stepped off public stages and into memory, the burden of remembrance shifted onto educators, institutions, communities, and the descendants of those who endured. The urgency remained, but the tools evolved. Education had to reach new generations, shaped by different questions, different contexts. No longer could it rely solely on personal testimony. It had to create connection through imagination, empathy, and conscience. Digital archives became central. Entire collections of documents, photographs, and testimonies were made available online. Students from Mumbai to Montreal could now hear a survivor's voice, explore the blueprint of a gas chamber, or read a child's final letter, all from their devices. Virtual reality tours of Auschwitz emerged, offering immersive journeys through the ruins, guided by survivors' recorded narration. AI technology began to preserve their voices interactively, allowing future generations to ask questions and receive answers as if in conversation. The past became more accessible than ever, fragile yet enduring. And with these advances came new possibilities. Educators could teach Auschwitz not only in history class, but in ethics courses, literature, civics, even art. The Holocaust became a mirror, reflecting timeless questions. What is justice? What does it mean to be human? What happens when law becomes a tool of cruelty? Could it happen again? These questions resonated deeply in a world still troubled by violence and division. In Rwanda, Cambodia, Bosnia, and Darfur, echoes of Auschwitz could be heard. Genocide scholars began to use Auschwitz as a foundational case, a framework to understand how hatred escalates, how bureaucracies can kill, and how silence enables catastrophe. Holocaust education became genocide education, a tool not just for remembrance but for prevention. Children of survivors, the so-called second generation, stepped forward too. Many had grown up in households filled with silence or haunted by fragmented memories. Now they began to tell their parents' stories. Some became historians, filmmakers, poets. Others led school programs, guided museum tours, or lit candles at ceremonies. They did not live through Auschwitz, but they carried it in their blood, their dreams, their grief. Meanwhile, governments began to formalize their commitments. January 27th, the anniversary of Auschwitz's liberation, was adopted as International Holocaust Remembrance Day by the United Nations in 2005. On that day, across continents, ceremonies take place in parliaments, schools, and public squares. Names are read aloud, survivors are honored, and for a moment the world pauses, not just to mourn, but to remember what it is capable of and what it must prevent. Yet, even with this growing awareness, the work of education faced headwinds. Holocaust denial, once confined to fringe circles, found new life online. Conspiracies spread through social media. In some places, political forces sought to rewrite history, to minimize complicity, to erase uncomfortable truths. Auschwitz was invoked inappropriately compared to unrelated political issues, stripped of context. The memory of the Holocaust, so hard-earned, risked being distorted or diluted. In response, educators redoubled their efforts. International organizations like the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance developed guidelines for teaching and commemorating the Holocaust responsibly. Museums created exhibits on denial and distortion. Social media campaigns featured survivors speaking directly to the camera, addressing myths with patience and clarity. In the face of misinformation, truth became a quiet form of resistance. Perhaps the most powerful aspect of Holocaust education is that it does not ask for admiration. It asks for attention. It does not glorify heroism, though there was heroism. It does not promise redemption, though there was resilience. It asks only that we listen, that we remember, that we teach our children not just about what happened, but why it happened and how it can be stopped. In classrooms today, when students learn about Auschwitz, they learn not only about the gas chambers or the barbed wire, they learn about the girl who saved a crust of bread for her brother, about the old man who whispered prayers in the darkness, about the doctor who refused to perform experiments, about the SS officer who looked away when he could have helped, about the silent world that watched the trains pass by. They learn that evil is not always loud. It can be polite, bureaucratic, orderly. It can wear a uniform, or a suit, or a neighbor's face. And they learn too that resistance can be quiet. A poem, a secret diary, a word of comfort, a refusal to hate. Education, in this sense, becomes not just an act of remembrance, but an act of moral inheritance. From the ashes of Auschwitz has grown a forest of voices, living, speaking, reaching forward into time. Each lesson is a leaf, each story a branch, and at the center stands a memory so vast it cannot be forgotten. In every child who asks, "What was Auschwitz?" the work begins again. And in every answer given with honesty and care, the promise of never again is renewed. The gates of Auschwitz, no longer close behind the desperate, the condemned, or the silenced. The chimneys no longer belch smoke into the sky, and the trains no longer arrive laden with fear. Yet the legacy of that place, the pain it wrought, the questions it left behind, the warning it etched into the conscience of the world, endures. Auschwitz is no longer a functioning camp, but it is not silent. Its ruins speak in ways that grow louder with each passing year. As the final chapter of its living memory draws near, the world must ask what remains, and what must we carry forward. The survivors who once emerged from its gates, emaciated, dazed, blinking into freedom, became the first keepers of its legacy. They carried the weight of remembrance not as a burden of the past, but as a message to the future. Through testimony, through quiet conversations, through moments when they lifted their tattooed arms and said, "I was there," they became the bridge between history and moral clarity. Each survivor was not just a witness, but a beacon, a living reminder that the world must never look away again. As time passed, that torch began to pass, from the survivors to their children, from their children to educators, historians, artists, and citizens. The responsibility of memory has grown heavier, not lighter, as years advance. For memory is not only about what happened, it is about how it is understood, how it is taught, how it is misused or denied or forgotten. Auschwitz's legacy demands more than ceremony, it demands vigilance. It also demands complexity. The legacy of Auschwitz is not a single lesson nor a simple moral fable. It is a tapestry woven from countless threads, the industrialization of murder, the psychology of obedience, the failure of empathy, the corruption of science, the the silence of bystanders, the power of ideology, and the persistence of evil. To understand Auschwitz is not merely to learn about genocide, it is to peer into the darkest depths of what humanity can become and what it must resist. The warning it offers is not metaphorical. Auschwitz was real. Its bricks were laid by hands, its gas chambers designed by engineers, its records typed by clerks. It was not the work of mythical monsters. It was built by people. Its warning is therefore not abstract. It reminds us that cruelty does not erupt overnight. It is cultivated, nurtured by propaganda, tolerated by indifference, emboldened by silence. It warns us of what can happen when the language of exclusion becomes normalized, when hate is legislated, when people are stripped of their names, their rights, their homes, when the machinery of the state turns against the vulnerable. Auschwitz was not inevitable, but once it began, it unfolded with terrible speed. And yet, the legacy of Auschwitz is not only a warning, it is also a tribute to survival, to the strength of those who endured, to the dignity of those who resisted, even if only by holding another's hand in their final moment, to the children who were born in its shadow and lived to speak of it, to the memory of those who did not survive, but whose names now live in books, in prayers, in stone. This legacy has inspired movements for justice across the globe. Human rights advocates, legal scholars, and ordinary citizens have invoked Auschwitz not to dwell on despair, but to strengthen resolve. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the Genocide Convention, and the very idea of crimes against humanity, these were born from the ashes of the Holocaust. Auschwitz, once a place of destruction, helped forge a legal and moral framework meant to protect the vulnerable, to hold the powerful accountable, and to affirm that dignity belongs to all. But legacies are not self-sustaining. They must be nurtured. Today, fewer people have a direct connection to the Holocaust. New generations grow up further from that era, shaped by different crises, different questions. For some, Auschwitz is just a word in a textbook or an image in a documentary. And in that distance, memory risks becoming hollow, recited but not felt, referenced but not understood. That is why preservation matters, not only of the physical site, but of the emotional truth. Auschwitz must remain not only as a museum, but as a moral landmark, a site not of despair, but of confrontation, a place where we measure ourselves not by what we condemn, but by what we defend. To walk the grounds of Auschwitz today is to step into a stillness that holds the weight of millions. The rusted rails no longer carry trains. The guard towers watch over empty fields. The shattered ruins of the gas chambers lie where they fell, untouched. Their destruction was a desperate attempt to erase evidence, but they failed. Their broken walls speak more eloquently than any intact structure ever could. And that is the lesson. Truth cannot be buried forever. Memory once planted will grow through stone. Visitors arrive from every corner of the world, school children, tourists, dignitaries, and scholars. They pass beneath the iron arch bearing the infamous words Arbeit macht frei, and they enter not only a former camp but a shared human reckoning. They move quietly past the photographs of inmates, their gazes haunting. They see the suitcases, the shoes, the hair, testaments to individuality swallowed by cruelty, and in the silence between footsteps, they feel it. This happened. And then comes the question, what now? That question is not easily answered. Auschwitz cannot be undone. The dead cannot return. But what we do with their memory, how we live in light of their loss, shapes the future. It is not enough to say, never again. The phrase must be lived. It must guide how we respond to hatred, how we treat strangers, how we confront injustice. even when it is inconvenient or unpopular. In this way, the legacy of Auschwitz reaches far beyond the Holocaust. It becomes a touchstone for all who struggle against tyranny and dehumanization. Civil rights movements, refugee advocates, journalists, and truth-tellers, many draw strength from the memory of those who perished in silence. Auschwitz has become both a site of mourning and a catalyst for action. Artists continue to reinterpret its meaning. New books, plays, films, and poems emerge each year. Some grapple with the enormity of loss. Others explore the echo of trauma across generations. Still, others look inward, asking what it means to be human after such inhumanity. In these works, Auschwitz becomes not only a place of death, but a wellspring of reflection, a mirror held up to the soul of civilization. There are also those who distort its legacy, who deny, diminish, or appropriate it. To them, Auschwitz is a political weapon, a point of provocation, a tool for false equivalence. These distortions do not silence memory, they betray it. But they also remind us that truth must be guarded, that remembrance is not passive, it is a responsibility, one that must be renewed each day. And so Auschwitz continues, not as it was, but as it means. It lives in the questions we ask our children, in the courage of those who stand against hate, in the quiet resolve of those who refuse to forget. It lives in the candle lit in the darkness, in the name whispered across time, in the silence held for strangers we will never meet. It lives in education, in memorials, in stories passed down through generations. In every act of remembrance, there is resistance. In every retelling, there is hope. In the end, the legacy of Auschwitz is not only about death, it is about the sacredness of life, the worth of a single soul, the danger of silence, the power of compassion, the urgency of truth, and the fragile, precious miracle that is human dignity. This is the warning it leaves us with. Do not look away. Do not forget. Do not let the world grow comfortable in its forgetting. And this is the promise it asks us to make, to remember, to teach, to protect the vulnerable, to speak when others are silent, to recognize the early signs, to resist the machinery of hate before it begins to turn. For as long as we carry that promise, Auschwitz will never be forgotten.